Today, I'm going to share two stories about missing people where every step of the investigation just raises more questions. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is very low on gasoline, go ahead and superglue their gas cap shut. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of August 12, 1970, a young man named Lawrence Hallahan drove along a coastal road in County Cork, Ireland. Out the car window to his right, he could see an area called Towhead Bay, which was a shoreline with a lot of really cool rock formations that also led out to the Atlantic Ocean. People came from all over Ireland to see Towhead Bay. But for Lawrence, the incredible view was just part of his daily commute, so he really wasn't paying much attention to it. However, as he's driving along, out of the corner of his eye, he sees something unusual floating in the water out in Towhead Bay. And he looks and he sees it was a sailboat, which was really odd, not because, boats don't go in the water, they do, but in Towhead Bay, people just didn't sail out there because it was just not safe. There was lots of rocks. This is not a place where you sail a boat. But then Lawrence, as he's driving along, sort of glancing out at the sailboat, he remembered this story that had been all over the news recently. It was about the 66-year-old retired naval officer named Edward Neal who had gone missing at sea. A few months ago, Edward had set off in his personal sailboat, which was called the Monaveen, on a journey from England to the Isle of Man. Now, the route was a very simple, straight shot that should have only taken about 36 hours to complete, but Edward had never arrived at his destination. His family had ultimately reported him missing, and the Coast Guard had been searching for his boat ever since. But so far, they hadn't found it anywhere. And so his disappearance had become this huge mystery, because it really just didn't make any sense. Number one, there hadn't been any serious storms in the area where he was going to be, and so it was just unlikely that his boat was, damaged or he was blown off course or something. But then two, let's say something did happen. Let's say there was an emergency, his boat was damaged, or he was blown off course, or something else happened. He was an expert sailor, an expert mariner. He was ready to handle practically any emergency at sea. But then even more, had something happened and had he been overwhelmed and even he couldn't handle it, he never made any distress calls. Not once. There was no distress calls from him at all, period. But now, as Lawrence looked out at the boat floating in Towhead Bay, which was hundreds of miles away from Edward's planned route, he saw the name on the boat. It said Monaveen, painted right on the side. It was Edward's. And so Lawrence's heart began to race, like he couldn't believe that he had just found this. Like, how was nobody else seeing this? And so without really thinking much about it, Lawrence parked his car, hopped out, and literally just ran down to the shore to go investigate further, to get a better look at the Monaveen. And so Lawrence, he carefully made his way across a bunch of slippery rocks until he finally reached the edge of the water. And the Monaveen really wasn't that far out into the water. It was floating maybe 3 or 4 yards away. And so, without even taking his shoes or anything off, Lawrence just leapt into the water and started swimming out to the boat. It only took him a few seconds to reach the boat, and when he did, he pulled himself up onto the deck. And once he was up there, Lawrence looked around and didn't see any obvious damage. But there also didn't seem like there was any signs of recent activity. So he just began calling out over and over, like, is anybody here? Anybody on board? But there was no response. It seemed like Edward must have at some point abandoned his boat. So Lawrence just began exploring, figuring there must have been some kind of problem on board, which must have caused Edward to have left it behind. And at this point, he didn't really feel like he was invading the guy's privacy because this was a huge news story. People were looking for him. And so Lawrence is like, maybe I can solve this mystery once and for all. And so Lawrence found his way to the helm of the boat, which is where the steering wheel is. And there, right beside the steering wheel, Lawrence saw a special type of two-way marine radio. And he just reached over and he pressed the on button, and to his shock, the radio turned on. The radio worked. And at this point, Lawrence felt a combination of confusion, of curiosity, and of just general unease. I mean, if the radio worked, why hadn't Edward just called for help? Lawrence saw there was an enclosed area in the center of the deck, which he knew must be where the boat's kitchen, the bathroom, and the bedroom were. So now, feeling a little bit nervous, he walked over, he found the door, and he pushed it open. And sure enough, Lawrence found himself standing inside the boat's kitchen. And the kitchen was very clean and also very well stocked. There were at least like a dozen packages of biscuits, along with a bunch of fresh water. There was tea, cocoa, powdered milk. And seeing all this made Lawrence even more confused, because why would Edward abandon an undamaged boat, at least so far it's undamaged, with a working radio and a bunch of food and water on board? However, when Lawrence walked from the kitchen into the bedroom area and saw what was in there, he realized that Edward had not abandoned his boat. Because right there, in the bed, was Edward, and he was dead. But it would turn out, once they found Edward's body, the mystery around what happened to him only got more bizarre. Because even though Edward had been missing for 3 months, an autopsy determined that he'd only been dead for about 1 month. But when Lawrence found him, Edward was so emaciated that he practically looked like a skeleton. He weighed just 62 pounds, and he had died of starvation. And so to this day, nobody has ever been able to explain where Edward was during those 2 months when the Coast Guard was searching for him and he wasn't dead yet. He was still alive. And why didn't he use his radio to call for help? And also, how did he starve to death when he was just a few steps away from a well-stocked kitchen? BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of November 10th, 1982, a 54-year-old woman named Mary Kemp was sitting in her living room in Salisbury, Maryland when her phone rang. She answered it, and she heard a voice that she instantly knew was her 35-year-old son, Don. And Mary smiled when he heard him. And she asked Don where he was and how he was doing. So for the past month, Don had been on this cross-country road trip. He was working on a book about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and to research it, he'd set out in his SUV to go visit a bunch of historical landmarks from the Civil War era. Now, since Don had set out on this trip, he had made a point to check in with his mother at least once a week to fill her in and let her know how it was going. And this morning, just from the tone of Don's voice, Mary could tell clearly it was still going great. And so, with the phone in hand, Mary walked over to the couch and she curled up and she listened as her son told her all about how he was now in Wyoming and he was planning to visit this Old West museum that was there in just a few days. Mary told him to keep it up and have a great time, and then before he hung up, he promised he would call her back in a few days. 6 days later, on the morning of November 16th, a highway patrolman was driving down a highway in Carbon County, Wyoming. Carbon County is located about 2,000 miles away from Mary's house in Maryland. This patrolman was basically out in the middle of nowhere, and through his windshield, all he could see were just open plains on either side, and everything was covered with a thick blanket of snow. But as the patrolman approached an exit ramp up ahead, he saw something that looked really out of place. There was an SUV just sitting on the exit ramp, just idling right in the middle of the road. Its doors were wide open. There were what appeared to be clothes scattered all over the road, sort of outside of this vehicle, and the car had a Maryland license plate. Now, clearly to the patrolman, something was wrong here. So he pulled over and he walked up to the SUV to make sure the driver was okay. But when he reached the vehicle and looked inside, because again, all the doors are open, there was nobody in there. But through the open doors, he noticed on the other side of the car, on the ground, were what appeared to be footprints, like a set of footprints. And so the patrolman walked around the car, being careful not to step on all the clothes that was out there. He goes to the other side and he sees clearly somebody climbed out of this vehicle on the passenger side, landed in the snow, and then he looked, and the footprints, they wandered not along the road, but they go off the road, just out into the wilderness. An hour later, a Carbon County Sheriff's deputy was trudging through the snow following those footprints. He, along with several other deputies that he was with, had been sent out here specifically to follow these tracks and see where they went, see what happened to the driver of this SUV. This is so strange. Why would this person have gotten out like that and just wandered off? What's going on? And so these deputies, they're walking along, looking down, following this trail, and overhead they can hear the sound of a plane, because a plane had also been dispatched to fly overhead to see if they could spot this driver somewhere out in the wilderness. Now, this area, the area where the driver sort of walked off into, was so flat and so empty, it really should have been quite easy to spot anybody who was, wandering around in the snow. But on the ground, the deputy, along with all the others, they couldn't see anybody ahead of them. The footprints just kept on going past fields and random farmhouses, and overhead, the pilot, he hadn't seen anyone yet either. And so for the deputies on the ground, after following these tracks for 6 miles, they started to wonder, are these ever going to end? What in the world was this person doing? Where were they going? But at about the 6-mile mark away from the highway, so away from the vehicle, the lead deputy, along with the others, they looked up ahead and they saw these tracks went right up to this big red barn off in the distance. That appeared to be the destination. And so now, moving with a bit of a purpose, because they're sensing they're about to, get to the end of this mystery here to see what happened to this driver, where they went, they began walking much faster and they followed the tracks right up to this barn. And where the tracks went into the barn was through this now closed door. But there were only prints going into the barn, and unless they exited the barn on the other side or something, it looked like they went into the barn and shut the door, and they're still inside of there. That was the initial impression. But when the lead deputy opened up that closed door and stepped inside, there was no one in there. It was clear that whoever had walked from the abandoned SUV to this barn had somehow left, but without leaving any new footprints in the snow, which literally should have been impossible. And so the lead deputy, he left the barn and just looked down at the prints that had led them there as if he was gonna learn something new. But actually, as he looked at these prints, which nobody else had stepped in, they had been very careful as they moved to this barn not to sully up the original prints, he noticed that some of the prints looked a little bit misshapen, almost like they had been stepped in more than once. And he got down closer and he began to realize that virtually all the prints that they had followed here were sort of misshapen. And so he began backtracking and he saw it the whole way. All these prints are like double prints. And so the only conclusion the lead deputy could come to, considering the prints stop at the barn and there's nobody in the barn, is that this driver, after walking 6 miles in the snow for reasons unknown to this barn, they must have left the barn and walked backwards, in reverse, in their original tracks, just back the way they came. And so the lead deputy and the others basically began walking the same tracks that brought them to the barn, but now in reverse, looking for maybe there's some point where it branches off and we just missed it. Maybe there's 1 or 2 steps that go off in a different direction, because no one walks 6 miles in reverse. And also, if that really happened, where is this person? But no, they followed the tracks all the way back to the car, and there were these duplicate prints in every one of them. So this person literally walked backwards for 6 miles, but then they're back at the car and they're where did they go? There's no other prints. There's nothing. Where are they? How is this even possible? That evening, investigators ran the abandoned SUV's license plate and learned that it belonged to a 35-year-old man named Don Kemp. Now, they couldn't get in touch with Don himself, but they did manage to get his mother, Mary, on the phone. And Mary told police that it actually did make sense that her son would be in Wyoming because he was on this big cross-country road trip. But she also said that she has no idea why he would have abandoned his car like that. And she said he had no history of mental illness, he wasn't taking any medications that could potentially disorient him, and he was just generally a really responsible guy. Like, this didn't make sense to her at all. So the sheriff's department just went back to, searching the wilderness around where the car was found, looking for Don Kemp, searching the wilderness area, searching near the barn, looking everywhere. But despite searching on foot, with planes and even on horseback, another really serious push to find him, they didn't find anything new. And then on the third day of this big search, a huge blizzard swept through the area and forced the search to stop. The investigators knew that if Don had still been alive and outside in the area, he almost certainly would have frozen to death during that blizzard. And if he'd left the area, then he probably had done so on purpose, and he didn't want to be found, which could explain why he'd apparently purposefully hidden his tracks when he had left the barn. So at the time of the blizzard, a decision was made not just to postpone the search, but actually to officially call it off. And then after the search ended, for months following it, Don Kemp's name remained in the news. His case was totally fascinating. It was so mysterious. Nobody knew what happened to him. But eventually, his case went totally cold. That is until April of 1983, so 5 months after Don disappeared. A woman in New York City received a very bizarre phone call. So this woman's name was Judy Aiello, and she actually knew Don personally because they had worked together for 10 years until Don actually went on to leave to go write his book, which entailed him eventually going off and, going missing. And so Judy was well aware of the fact that Don was missing and that the police were still basically looking for him, maybe not actively, but there was definitely an ongoing search for him. And she knew that so far nobody really knew anything. It was just this big mystery. And so with that as context, one day that April, Judy came home from work and she saw that she had a message on her answering machine. So she clicked the play button. And to her shock, the voice she heard that came out of this answering machine was Don Kemp's. All he said was, "I'd like to speak to you again. Call me." And then he gave the phone number to reach him at. And that was it. That was the whole message. But again, Judy had worked with him for 10 years. She's well aware of the fact that he's missing. Like, she knows this is him. And immediately she calls this phone number because pretty much like everybody else, the belief here was that Don was very likely dead. And now it's like, no, he's fine. He's just called me. He's good. I'm going to find out what happened to him. Everything's going to be fine. And so she calls back this number expecting to hear Don. But when somebody picks up, it is a man, but it's definitely not Don. And so Judy, she just said, "Hey, I'd like to speak to Don Kemp. Can you put me in touch with him? He gave me this number." And the man on the other end of the line, he was very nervous. And he really wasn't sure why she was calling. It was very uncomfortable for him. And at some point he was like, "Okay, I'll let you talk to Don." But then very quickly he was like, no, he's not here. And then Judy, she's like, "Well, it's really important that I talk to him. Can you please at least tell him that I returned his call and have him call me back?" And the man was like, "Oh, okay." And he took down her number and he's like, "Oh, I'll tell him." And then he hung up. And so Judy, she slowly lowered the receiver and put it back in the cradle. And her first thought was like, wow, that was really weird and also very disappointing. I really want to talk to Don. But then she was thinking, wait a minute, is this whole thing just a prank? Because after all, Don's disappearance has been all over the news and any random person could have heard about it and maybe, found out that she knew him. And it seemed like a really cruel thing to do, but it was possible. However, as she thought about that, she realized that no, this literally could not be a prank. And not just because she was completely certain that the voice on her answering machine had been Don's, but also because Judy's phone number was not listed in a phone book anywhere, which meant whoever placed the call and left that voicemail had to have known Judy personally. There was no other way to get that number. And so at that point, Judy realized it was not good enough to wait and hope that Don called her back. She had to go talk to the police. The next day, almost 2,000 miles away from New York City, where Judy had reported the bizarre phone call to the police, a police captain in Casper, Wyoming, knocked on the door of a trailer. So this captain, whose name was Mark Benton, had found out that the phone call Judy had received that she reported to police had been traced to this address in Wyoming, to this trailer. And this address was actually only about a 2-hour drive from the location where Don Kemp's abandoned SUV was found 5 months earlier. Benton already knew that this trailer belonged to a man named Mark Dennis. So when the door opened and Benton saw a man standing there, he asked, "Are you Mark Dennis?" And the man nodded and said, "Yes." So at that point, Captain Benton explained that he was there to investigate a phone call that had been traced back to this address, and that this phone call was potentially connected to the disappearance of a man named Don Kemp. But Mark just sort of stared back at Benton with a look of total confusion on his face. And then he said he didn't know anything about a phone call to New York, and that he had never even heard of a Don Kemp. Now, Benton was not totally buying this, because the idea that this guy lives 2 hours away from where Don went missing, and it was all over the news, 5 months ago, and still is on the news pretty regularly. The idea that you had never heard of this guy, it was just a little bit fishy. And so we asked Mark if he'd be willing to come take a polygraph. And to his surprise, Mark said, sure. A couple of days later, Benton was sitting in his office at the sheriff's department, and he called Mark to schedule his polygraph. But Mark didn't answer the phone, so Benton left him a voicemail. And then a little while later, Benton got a call back. But it was not from Mark. It was from his new attorney, who said Mark would no longer be speaking to the police any further about this topic. A few weeks later, and another 2,000 miles away, Don's mother, Mary Kemp, sat in her home in Maryland, clutching the phone to her ear as Captain Benton gave her an update on her son's case. So Mary knew about the phone call Judy had received, which actually had been followed by several more calls, all from the same number. Judy never actually answered these calls. They all went to voicemail. They all sounded like Dawn. The messaging was very similar. It's like, I want to talk to you, call me back. But she was never able to actually connect with Dawn. Judy wasn't. And so for Mary, she was convinced that the answer to her son's disappearance must have something to do with Mark Dennis, because he was the guy who owned the trailer where all these calls were coming from, and he's lawyered up instead of taking his polygraph. Like, it must have to do with him. What other solution could there be here? Like, he must be involved. He has to be. But now, as part of his update to Mary, Captain Benton was telling her that Mark Dennis had outright denied knowing her son. And because Mark was not officially a suspect, they didn't have any concrete evidence against him, and he wasn't talking because he had lawyered up, the police were not planning to investigate him any further. And Mary, when she heard this, was genuinely stunned. I mean, those calls from Mark's trailer were the only clue that anybody had found in months. And she just couldn't understand why the investigators weren't looking into this more seriously. From day one, she had felt like Dawn's disappearance was at the bottom of the sheriff department's priority list. They'd called off the search after only a few days, and now they'd barely looked into the only suspect they had, who again lawyered up as soon as he was asked to take a polygraph test. Like, what is that? And so Mary wasn't sure if, these investigators were just incompetent or what, but she knew that at this point, there was only one thing she could do. She was going to fly out to Wyoming, and she was going to investigate her son's disappearance herself. A few weeks later, a very agitated Mary Kemp barged into the Carbon County Sheriff's Office in Wyoming, which was the law enforcement agency that originally investigated Dawn's disappearance. She walked right up to the front desk, identified herself, and demanded to see all the files on her son's case. The clerk looked a little bit taken aback by the way Mary was acting, but she nodded and then got up and went into the back of the office, and about a minute later, she came back with a file folder. And so she hands it over to Mary. Mary grabs it. She walks over to a nearby chair. She sits down. She opens up this file folder, and she begins flipping through all the evidence that had been collected so far. And Mary very quickly realized that there was way more to this story than the investigators had told her. Because as she looked at photos of her son's car from where it had been found on the highway when it was abandoned, she realized that it didn't actually look like her son had just stopped at random, gotten out, and walked off like the police had said. No, his car looked like it had been struck. So the mirror on the passenger side of the car was broken, and a gasket had been ripped off the door. So the gasket is the rubber sealing around the rim of the door so that when it shuts, it seals. Well, part of it had been ripped off the door. And also the key, which was still in the ignition when the car was found, was completely bent in half. And so to Mary, based on these photos, it immediately seemed obvious, at least to her, that her son did not just pull over and walk off. He must have been forced off the side of the road. Maybe somebody struck his car and, maybe they drove off, but maybe the impact of the strike had disoriented her son and it caused him to wander off. Or maybe somebody intentionally ran him off the road and then forced him, grabbed him and dragged him out of the car and let him off somewhere. But then also Mary's thinking, well, if there was another person who got out of their vehicle, where are their prints? Because there was only one set of prints, my son's. Or was that my son's prints? Are those his prints? She didn't know. And so it was just totally confounding. But Mary realized even if there was somebody else that sort of caused her son to go missing, somebody who ran him off the road or who grabbed him and pulled him out or whatever, overlooking all the facts, which are like, where are their footprints and why isn't there another car that we found that ran into him? Forget all that. Mary realized if there were other people involved, it was going to be nearly impossible to figure out who they were. Because for reasons she just could not understand, the investigators had not fingerprinted her son's car when it was found, and they hadn't made casts of the footprints in the snow. So there was no way to prove if anyone besides Dawn had been in the car, or if Dawn was even the one who made those tracks in the snow. And so any forensic evidence that could have maybe helped solve this case was now long gone. So if Mary wanted to find her son, she basically had to start from scratch. Over the next few weeks, Mary Kemp stayed in Wyoming and conducted her own investigation. She tracked down Mark Dennis, the man from the trailer where those bizarre phone calls had originated, and she actually spoke to him on the phone. However, just like he had with the police, Mark denied knowing anything about Dawn or those phone calls, and when Mary accused him of lying, he just hung up. Mary visited all the places she could think of where Dawn might have gone to. She also spoke to workers at the museums and other locations where she knew her son had been planning to go as part of his research for his book. She hired a private investigator, she put up posters with a reward for information, and she even went to a psychic for help. But basically, nothing worked. She got nowhere until finally, she got one meaningful lead. Through her investigation, Mary learned that apparently in April of 1983, around the time Judy got those strange phone calls, two people had seen a man who matched Dawn's description in Casper, which was the same town where Mark Dennis's trailer was. One was a bartender at a local tavern who remembered serving Dawn, and the other was someone who remembered seeing him at a traveling exhibit about Abraham Lincoln. And remember, the whole reason Dawn was even out there to begin with was to research Abraham Lincoln, so Mary thought that sighting at least had to be credible. I mean, it would be a pretty crazy coincidence if Dawn just happened to have a perfect doppelganger in Casper, Wyoming, who also happened to love Abraham Lincoln. However, by the time Mary actually learned about these sightings, it had been at least a full month since the actual sightings occurred, and now it seemed like if Dawn really had been in Casper, he wasn't anymore. Mary didn't find any other trace of her son there, or any clues as to where he might have gone next. I mean, the whole situation was so weird that Mary literally couldn't form a coherent theory about what might have happened to her son. In fact, the more Mary thought about it, the less sense any of this made. And so basically, she just reached a total dead end and eventually gave up and went back home to Maryland. And for the next 2 years, Mary continued not to get any answers about her son. But then, on October 4th of 1985, so almost 3 years after Dawn disappeared, everything changed. That day, a group of hunters were hiking through the woods in Carbon County, Wyoming, when one of them looked up ahead and they saw what looked like a bunch of white rocks lying in the grass. And so these hunters, they moved up to get a better look at these rocks. And as they got closer, they realized they were definitely not rocks. They were bones. And in fact, as they got close enough, they saw it was not just a couple of bones. It was like a perfectly intact human skeleton just lying in the grass, still wearing clothes, but just bones inside the clothes. When sheriff's investigators arrived on the scene, they found a wallet that was inside the skeleton's pants pocket. And in that wallet, there was a driver's license with the name Don Kemp. An autopsy found that Don had died of exposure, and there was no sign of foul play. The sheriff department's official conclusion was that on the day he disappeared, Don must have suffered a mental breakdown and walked into the wilderness voluntarily, and then at some point he had died, likely in that blizzard that happened 3 days later. Now, this sounds like a neat and tidy explanation, but really it only raises more questions. Because Don's body was found only 4 miles away from where his car was abandoned. Investigators had searched that area for days, and even if Don had been trying to hide from the search teams for whatever reason, this area was so bare and so flat that there really was nowhere to hide. And so it's just hard to imagine that Don was basically right there the whole time and nobody saw him. But then even if Don really had somehow died in the blizzard 3 days after his car was found, and despite all this search effort, he was never located, let's pretend that actually happened. Well, who made those phone calls from Mark Dennis's trailer 5 months later to Judy? Like, who was that? And also, how had he been spotted by 2 different people walking around the same town where those calls came from? And if there really was no foul play involved, why was Don's car so weirdly damaged when it was found? Like, who did that? The Carbon County Sheriff's Department was never able to answer any of those questions. And so Mary Kemp, when she died in 2014, died still wondering what really happened to her son. If mysterious deaths that leave behind more questions than answers are your kind of story, then you should really check out another episode of ours on Ricky McCormick, which is another very bizarre, deeply puzzling case where the truth proved to be incredibly difficult to pin down.
At 1:30 in the morning on a Sunday, a man stood on the flat gravel roof of a massive building in the center of the city. And he was wearing dark clothes and leather gloves, and he was holding a very thick, custom-woven nylon climbing rope. So he walked to the edge of the roof and looked down at the street below to make sure no one was watching. But the street was completely empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of a street sweeper blocks away. And so he turned around and walked toward the center of the roof, where a series of large glass skylights were built into the structure. Now he found a heavy steel vent pipe that was bolted directly into the concrete roof, and he tied one end of his nylon rope tightly around the pipe, pulling it hard with his full body weight to test the tension. Then he walked over to the nearest skylight and knelt down on the gravel. He used a small metal pry bar to carefully wedge out the frame, holding a large pane of glass. He removed the glass, set it quietly on the roof, and dropped the loose end of his rope down into the dark hole. He grabbed the line, stepped off the edge of the roof, and slid 30 feet down into the pitch-black room below. And when his heavy boots hit the solid marble floor, he let go of the rope, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a loaded revolver. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please take the like button out for a nice, expensive seafood dinner, and then right when the waiter brings the check, pretend you left your wallet in the car and just run away. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. Okay, let's get into today's story. In September of 1972, the city of Montreal, Canada was shutting down for the long Labor Day weekend. And as the temperatures began to drop and the summer ended, thousands of residents packed their bags and left the city to visit family or go to the countryside. So the downtown streets were unusually quiet and the traffic was almost non-existent. And sitting right in the middle of this quiet city was the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Now this was an incredibly prestigious institution housed in a massive neoclassical stone building on Sherbrooke Street. It had tall white marble columns, thick oak doors, and wide stone steps leading up to the main entrance, and inside its walls, the museum held some of the most valuable historical artifacts and pieces of art on the entire continent. There were ancient sculptures, rare jewelry, and original oil paintings by European masters that were hundreds of years old. It was essentially a fortress of wealth and history. But because the building was so old, it required a massive amount of constant maintenance to keep it standing. And in the late summer of 1972, the museum board had approved a major renovation project to repair the aging roof. So the exterior of the stone building was completely covered in tall steel construction scaffolding. The scaffolding reached from the sidewalk all the way up to the flat roof, creating a temporary metal staircase on the outside of the museum. But, since it was the Labor Day holiday weekend, the large construction crews had packed up all their heavy tools, locked their equipment boxes, and gone home for a 3-day break. And that meant the museum was totally closed to the public, locked up tight and sitting completely empty except for a skeleton crew of security guards. Now, back in 1970, museum security was very different than it is today. The Montreal Museum did not have advanced motion sensors, and they did not have laser grids crossing the hallways, and they didn't have high-definition cameras recording every room. They relied almost entirely on human patrols to keep the building secure. And on the night of September 3rd, going into the early morning hours of September 4th, there were exactly 3 security guards working the night shift. And for these men, the job was incredibly routine and largely uneventful. The senior guard on duty was a man in his late 50s, and he had worked this exact shift for years, so he knew every inch of the building by heart. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked in the Renaissance wing, and he knew how the streetlights from outside cast long, strange shadows across the marble statues in the lobby. So, his routine was very simple. The 3 guards would sit at a small wooden desk on the ground floor, drink coffee from thermoses, and read the newspaper. And then at very specific scheduled intervals, one of the guards would pick up a heavy metal flashlight, clip a ring of keys to his belt, and walk a designated patrol route through the dark building. And the guard was required to walk through the main galleries, check the physical locks on all the exterior doors, and shine his light into the dark corners just to make sure nobody had stayed inside after hours. And for the guards, this was just an incredibly boring, repetitive job. The museum at night was totally silent, except for the low, constant hum of the ventilation system and the sharp sound of their own hard-soled shoes clicking on the marble floors. The walls of the museum were lined with thousands of painted faces staring out from the antique portraits. But the guards were so used to the environment that they didn't even look at the art anymore. They just wanted to finish their required rounds, punch their time cards, and go back downstairs to their coffee. At exactly 1:30 in the morning, the senior guard stood up from the desk on the ground floor, and he picked up his flashlight, checked the time on his watch, and started his patrol. He walked away from the other 2 guards, pushed open a set of heavy wooden doors, and walked up the wide marble staircase to the 2nd floor. Now, the 2nd floor of the museum housed the European Masters Collection. This was a long, cavernous, rectangular room with very high ceilings. And built into the ceiling were large, square glass skylights that were designed to let natural sunlight illuminate the paintings during the day. But at 1:30 in the morning, the skylights were just squares of black glass, and the gallery room was pitch dark. So the guard walked slowly down the exact center of the room. He swung his heavy flashlight beam in a slow arc from left to right, illuminating the massive carved wooden frames and the dark oil canvases on the walls. And as he walked, everything looked completely normal. The doors were shut, the paintings were in their correct spots, and the room was totally empty. He reached the far end of the long gallery, stopped, turned around, and started walking back toward the marble staircase. But as he took a step forward, he heard a sound. It was a faint, quick scuffing noise, like the rubber sole of a heavy boot pivoting sharply on the polished marble floor. And so he stopped walking. He stood completely still in the dark, gripping his flashlight tightly, and he slowly turned the beam toward the source of the noise. And standing directly in the circle of white light were 3 men. They were wearing dark, heavy clothing, and they had dark knit ski masks pulled down completely over their faces. And all 3 of the men were holding revolvers, and the barrels were pointed directly at the guard's chest. "Drop the light," the man in the center said. The guard opened his fingers. The heavy metal flashlight hit the marble floor with a loud crack and rolled away, casting long, erratic, spinning shadows across the gallery walls. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the man said. And the guard did exactly what he was told. He knew he was completely unarmed, and he knew there was absolutely no way to fight 3 men with drawn guns in a locked building. So he turned around and placed his hands behind his back. The thieves stepped forward quickly, grabbed his arms, and used thick tape to bind his wrists tightly together. Then the thieves grabbed the guard by the shoulders and walked him down the main marble staircase. They moved very quietly and methodically, not rushing or panicking. They went straight down to the ground floor and walked directly to the small desk where the other two guards were sitting and drinking coffee. And before the two men could even stand up or reach for a phone, the thieves stepped into the room with their guns raised. The men forced the other two guards onto the floor. They tied their wrists and their ankles with tape and rope, and then they dragged all three of the bound guards into a small, windowless administrative office just off the main hallway. They laid the three men face down on the thin carpet. "Stay quiet, and you won't get hurt," one of the men said. And then the thieves stepped out of the office and pulled the heavy door shut, leaving the three security guards totally alone in the dark. Now the three thieves have total uninterrupted control of the entire museum, and they do not run. They don't sprint through the hallways, smashing cases or grabbing the first shiny objects they see. Instead, they walk calmly back up the wide marble staircase and return to the second-floor gallery, and they begin to work. They spend 2 full hours inside the building, and they are incredibly selective about what they touch. They walk past dozens of very expensive, beautiful paintings and ignore them completely. They have a specific plan, and they are looking for very specific items. They stop in front of a sprawling landscape painting by the Dutch master Rembrandt. The painting is nearly 300 years old, and it is mounted inside a massive, heavy wooden frame carved with intricate designs. So 2 of the men step up to the wall, grab the thick sides of the frame, and lift it straight up off the heavy metal hooks, holding it in place. They lower the massive piece of art and lay it flat on the marble floor, and then one of the men takes out a very sharp razor knife. He kneels down on the floor, presses the blade against the very edge of the canvas, and traces the knife along the inside edge of the wood, cutting the old brittle canvas totally free from its backing. And once the painting is loose, they carefully roll the thick canvas up into a tight, compact tube. They move further down the gallery wall. They find a highly detailed painting by the French artist Delacroix. They pull the heavy frame off the wall, lay it on the marble, cut the canvas out with the razor knife, and roll it up. And they repeat this exact same process over and over again in the dark. They strip 18 separate master paintings from their frames. They leave the heavy gilded wooden borders scattered all over the gallery floor, looking like hollow, discarded skeletons. Then the men walk out of the European Masters Gallery and move over to a smaller exhibition room that houses the museum's antique jewelry collection. They walk right up to a large reinforced glass display case, and one of the men uses a heavy metal tool to smash the glass into pieces. Now, the glass shattering does actually trip a security alarm, and a loud bell starts ringing. But the museum system is so old and isolated that the alarm only rings loudly inside the building itself. It does not send an automatic signal to the local police station. So the thieves realize no one is coming, and they just completely ignore the ringing bell. They reach their gloved hands into the broken case and start pulling out the jewelry. They take incredibly heavy, thick, solid gold necklaces, large silver brooches, and intricate pieces heavily encrusted with raw diamonds and large emeralds. They systematically clear the shelves, taking 39 separate pieces of heavy antique jewelry, and they drop all of it into a large, durable canvas bag. And when they are finally done shopping, they gather all of their carefully selected loot. They carry the thick, layered bundle of 18 rolled-up oil canvases and the bulging, heavy canvas bag of jewelry, and they walk back to the exact center of the second-floor gallery. They set the bundle of art and the heavy bag down on the floor, directly underneath the open skylight, and they look up. And hanging 30 feet down from the ceiling is the thick, custom-woven nylon climbing rope that the first man had tied to the roof vent and used to slide down into the building. And this is the exact moment, Mia, where the 3 thieves look down at the massive pile of stolen treasure resting on the marble floor, and they look back up at the rope, and they realize they have made a catastrophic miscalculation. When they originally planned this flawless heist, the idea was incredibly simple. They would use the construction scaffolding to access the roof drop in through the glass skylight, collect the art, tie the bag securely to the bottom of the rope, and pull everything back up. Then they would climb the rope themselves, run across the flat gravel roof, climb down the steel scaffolding, and disappear into the city without ever opening a ground floor door. But as they stand there in the quiet gallery, the harsh reality of basic physics sets in. 18 large canvases heavily coated in thick layers of centuries-old oil paint and coated in dense hardened varnish weigh a tremendous amount. and the canvas bag filled with 39 pieces of solid gold, silver, and heavy gemstones adds dozens of more pounds to the pile. The custom-woven rope they brought specifically to haul the treasure out is now completely useless. There is absolutely no physical way that three men can climb a single nylon rope while carrying that massive amount of dead weight strapped to their backs. And they cannot stand on the roof and pull the bags up by hand because the load is simply too heavy to hoist 30 feet straight up in the air without a heavy mechanical winch. Their perfect, untraceable roof escape route is completely ruined. But the thieves do not panic, and they do not start arguing. And they certainly don't leave the priceless art sitting on the floor. Instead, they just silently adjust. So they lean down and pick up the heavy bundle of rolled canvases. They grab the thick straps of the jewelry bag, and they completely abandon the rope. They leave it hanging from the dark ceiling, swaying just slightly in the cool draft coming down from the open skylight. They turn around, walk right out of the gallery, and walk down the main marble staircase. They walk straight past the closed administrative office door where the three guards are still tied up on the floor. And they walk directly to a side exit door that leads straight out to the street level. Because they are already inside the building, they don't need to pick a lock or use a key. They just push hard on the interior metal crash bar. The heavy door clicks open, and they walk out into the cool September air, load the incredibly heavy art into a vehicle parked on the quiet street, and simply drive away into the night. Several hours go by. The sun finally starts to rise over Montreal, casting light through the skylights and illuminating the empty frames on the floor. And down in the small administrative office, the senior security guard slowly manages to stretch and twist his taped bindings just enough to get his hands free. He quickly unties the other two guards, and they immediately run to a desk phone and call the local police. Within minutes, police cruisers surround the entire museum with their sirens blaring. Dozens of uniformed officers rush into the building to secure the perimeter. And the lead detectives run straight up the marble stairs to the second floor to see exactly what was taken. They walk into the European Masters Gallery. They see the massive empty wooden frames scattered haphazardly across the floor. They see the shattered glass from the jewelry case crunching under their shoes. And then they look up, and they see the heavy nylon rope dangling straight down from the open skylight. And immediately, the investigators make a massive assumption. They look at the hanging rope, and they look at the empty walls, and they assume that because the thieves clearly entered through the roof, they must have escaped through the roof as well. The detectives believe that they are dealing with a highly sophisticated military-level crew who set up an elaborate heavy-duty rigging system on the roof to haul the heavy art up through the skylight. So the police focus all of their initial energy and resources looking up. They send dozens of officers to aggressively canvass the neighboring rooftops. They call in police aviation units to fly helicopters over the block, searching the gravel roofs for signs that a private helicopter might have landed to extract the men. They spend critical, highly valuable hours trying to figure out exactly how the thieves managed to fly away with the heavy paintings. But the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. The thieves didn't use a helicopter, and they didn't have an elaborate mechanical roof rig. They just walked out the side door. And because the police spent those crucial first few hours looking at the roof and searching the skyline, they completely missed the fact that the thieves had escaped on the ground level. The criminals were given a massive head start, and they used that time to completely vanish. In the weeks that followed, the heist became massive front-page news all across the country. The museum actually received a typed ransom note from the thieves, demanding $500,000 in cash for the safe return of the art. The museum directors desperately wanted the paintings back, so they agreed to pay it, and they set up a secret sting operation with the police to make the drop. But the thieves somehow realized it was a trap, and they never showed up to collect the money. The investigation stayed open and highly active for decades. The police followed hundreds of leads, searched properties, and interviewed countless suspects, deeply embedded in the criminal underworld. But the men in the ski masks were completely gone, leaving no fingerprints and no usable evidence behind. Today, the 1972 break-in remains the largest art heist in Canadian history. Out of everything that was stolen that night, only 2 very minor pieces of jewelry were ever recovered. They were found abandoned in a rented locker at a local train station shortly after the theft. But the 18 master paintings, including the priceless Rembrandt landscape, have never been found. Nobody was ever arrested, and nobody was ever officially charged with the crime. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for who pulled it off or where the art ended up. The thieves in Montreal slipped away into the night by simply walking out a door, leaving nothing but an empty museum behind. But sometimes people leave behind far more than just an empty room. Sometimes they leave behind a recording. On a warm Thursday evening in October of 1973, the coastal town of Pascagoula, Mississippi was winding down for the day. And Pascagoula was not a tourist destination or a quiet farming community. It was a heavy industrial town sitting right on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, and the entire local economy basically revolved around the massive, sprawling shipyards that lined the river. So if you lived in Pascagoula in the 1970s, you most likely spent your days doing grueling manual labor. You were welding thick plates of steel, you were operating heavy cranes, or you were fitting massive industrial pipes deep inside the hulls of cargo ships. And it was incredibly loud, dangerous, and exhausting work. So the men who worked these yards were generally very hardened, practical, and grounded people. They did not spend their time talking about science fiction, and they certainly did not care about the paranormal. And 42-year-old Charles Hickson was exactly that kind of guy. Charles was a veteran who had seen active combat in the Korean War, and he had come back home to build a very quiet, predictable life. He had a wife, he had kids, and he had a steady, respectable job as a pipe fitter at the Ingalls shipbuilding yard. And he was known around town as a guy who just kept his head down, did his work, and provided for his family. And working on Charles's crew at the shipyard was a 19-year-old kid named Calvin Parker. Now, Calvin had just recently moved down to the coast from a very small rural farming town in the northern part of the state. He was trying to get on his feet, save some money, and figure out his life. So Charles had kind of taken the teenager under his wing, showing him the ropes at the massive industrial yard and helping him navigate the heavy workload. And by the time the shift whistle blew on Thursday, October 11th, both men were completely covered in grease and sweat, and they were entirely exhausted. But instead of just going straight home to sleep, Charles decided that they needed to unwind. So he told Calvin they were going to go down to the river and do some night fishing. And fishing was a very common pastime in Pascagoula, so they stopped at a local bait shop, picked up a styrofoam bucket of live minnows, and drove Charles's car down toward the water. Now, they didn't go to a public pier or a crowded beach. They drove over to an abandoned piece of property known as the Old Schaupeter Shipyard, and this was a desolate, overgrown stretch of riverbank where an old business had completely collapsed years ago. There was rusty scrap metal in the tall grass, and there was an old rotting wooden pier jutting out into the black water of the Pascagoula River. It was totally isolated, it was pitch dark, and there was nobody else around for miles. So they parked the car, grabbed their heavy fiberglass rods and their tackle boxes, and walked down to the water's edge to set up. They cast their lines out into the deep water, and they just sat there in the dark. And for a long time, everything was perfectly normal. The air was thick and humid, smelling heavily of salt marsh and the sulfur from a distant paper mill. And the only sounds were the small waves slapping against the rotting wooden pilings and the distant, muffled hum of traffic rolling across Highway 90 a few miles away. And they sat there for over an hour, just talking, quietly, waiting for the fish to bite. But the water was completely dead. So Calvin was starting to get a little bit bored, and he was staring down at his shoes wondering when Charles would finally call it a night. But Charles was entirely focused on the glowing tip of his fishing rod, waiting for the slightest pull. And right around 9 o'clock at night, the quiet atmosphere on the riverbank completely shifted. Charles heard a sudden sound coming from the sky just behind them. It was a strange, low-pitched whirring noise, almost like the sound of heavy metal scraping rapidly against other metal. And at first, Charles did not even turn his head. He just assumed that a night crew at one of the neighboring shipyards across the river was starting up a heavy crane or turning on an industrial generator. Because they were sitting in the middle of a massive industrial zone, so sudden mechanical noises were a completely reasonable explanation. So he just kept his eyes on his fishing rod. But the whirring noise rapidly grew louder and louder until it felt like the ground beneath their boots was physically vibrating. And then, a massive, brilliant blue light suddenly reflected off the surface of the black water right in front of them, lighting up the entire riverbank like it was the middle of the day. So Charles finally turned around to see what was happening. And hovering in the air just 30 yards away from where they were standing was a massive, glowing, oval-shaped object. It was roughly 30 feet long and maybe 10 feet tall, with a slightly rounded dome on the top. And it had no visible wings, no propellers, no windows, and absolutely no seams in the metal. It just hovered silently, about 2 feet off the dirt, pulsating with a blinding, hazy blue light. And Charles just froze his brain, completely unable to process what he was looking at. He stood completely still, gripping his fishing rod while the whirring sound filled his ears. And beside him, Calvin slowly turned around and immediately dropped his tackle box in the dirt. But before either of the men could turn and run for the car, an opening suddenly appeared on the curved side of the smooth craft, and a blinding white light spilled out from the interior, casting long, sharp shadows across the overgrown grass. And then 3 figures emerged from the doorway. But they did not step down onto the grass, and they did not walk. They simply glided through the air, hovering inches above the uneven ground, moving in a perfectly straight line directly toward the 2 men. And as they got closer, Charles could see that they were roughly 5 feet tall, but they did not look human. Their skin was pale and heavily wrinkled, resembling thick gray leather. They had completely rounded heads with no visible eyes, no ears, and no necks. There was just a small slit where a mouth should be, and 3 pointed protrusions sticking out from their faces. And their arms were incredibly long, ending in what looked like heavy, pincer-like claws instead of human fingers. And when Calvin saw these things floating over the scrap metal toward him, his brain completely shut down. The 19-year-old teenager let out a short gasp. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he instantly fainted, collapsing face first into the muddy riverbank. So Charles is now standing completely alone, watching these 3 gray figures glide over the body of his unconscious friend. And he wants to fight. He wants to swing his heavy fishing rod or grab the hunting knife from his belt, but his body absolutely refuses to respond. He is completely paralyzed, his muscles totally locked in place. 2 of the figures glide directly up to Charles, one on each side, and they reach out with their pincer-like hands and clamp down on his arms. And the absolute second they touch his skin, Charles feels a sudden, intense wave of freezing numbness shoot through his entire body. He cannot feel his legs, he cannot feel his chest, he cannot even feel his own heartbeat, and then his work boots slowly lift off the muddy ground. The figures easily pull him backward through the air, floating him effortlessly toward the blinding white light of the open doorway. They pull him through the side of the craft and into a brightly lit, totally seamless, sterile room. There are no chairs, no tables, and no visible light fixtures. The brilliant, painful light just seems to be radiating directly from the smooth walls themselves, and the figures float Charles into the absolute center of the room and simply leave him suspended there. Hovering completely parallel to the floor, staring up at the curved ceiling, he cannot turn his head and he cannot close his eyelids. And suddenly, a large, dark, mechanical object drops down from the ceiling. It looks somewhat like a massive metallic eye, and it begins moving very slowly back and forth across his body, stopping over his chest, his stomach, and his legs. Charles is absolutely convinced that he is about to be killed. He cannot scream, he cannot breathe heavily. He is just trapped inside his own mind, waiting for the painful end. But then, just as quickly as the mechanical eye appeared, it retracts back into the seamless ceiling. The 2 figures glide back to Charles, grip his arms with their pincers, and float him backward through the doorway. They carry him out into the humid night air, move him across the tall grass, and roughly drop him back onto the riverbank. Charles hits the ground hard, his boots sliding in the mud. He instantly regains control of his muscles, and he falls forward onto his hands and knees, gasping for air. He looks frantically to his left, and he sees Calvin standing near the water's edge, awake, but completely hysterical. The teenager has his arms wrapped tightly around his own chest, and he is just weeping uncontrollably, staring at the dirt. And Charles looks up, just in time to see the blue light of the craft shoot straight up into the pitch-black sky at a blinding speed and completely vanish, leaving the riverbank totally silent once again. For several minutes, neither man says a single word. They just stand there in the dark, breathing heavily, listening to the water hit the pilings. Finally, Charles manages to get his legs underneath him. He grabs Calvin by the shoulder, leaves all of their expensive fishing gear sitting in the mud, and they run as fast as they can up the dirt path to the parked car. Charles fumbles with his keys, shoves them into the ignition, and locks the heavy doors. They sit in the dark front seat of the car for nearly an hour. They are in a state of total shock, and they are both visibly shaking. Charles reaches into the glove compartment, pulls out a small bottle of liquor he keeps there, and they both take a sharp drink just to try and stop their teeth from chattering. And Charles knows that if they go home and tell their families, everyone will think they are crazy. But he also knows they just survived something deeply unnatural, and he feels a strict moral obligation to report it to the authorities. So Charles puts the car in gear speeds out of the old shipyard and drives directly to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. They pull into the brightly lit parking lot around 10:30 at night, walk through the heavy glass doors, and walk up to the front desk. And they look absolutely terrible. They are covered in dried mud, they are pale, they are sweating heavily, and they reek of cheap liquor. And Captain Glenn Ryder is the senior officer on duty that night. So Ryder pulls them out of the lobby and puts them into a small side office. And Charles, completely out of breath, begins telling this seasoned police captain a wild, unbelievable story about glowing ships, floating gray monsters, and forced medical exams. And Captain Ryder just sits behind his desk, holding a pen listening to this completely absurd story. And Ryder immediately assumes they are totally drunk or high on drugs. He thinks this is a complete waste of police resources. So Captain Ryder separates the two men. He puts them in different rooms and grills them aggressively, looking for holes in their stories. He administers a field sobriety test, assuming they are highly intoxicated, but they both easily pass. The tiny sip of liquor from the glove box was not nearly enough to impair them, but Captain Ryder is still completely unconvinced. He knows that people pull elaborate pranks all the time just to get their names in the local newspaper or to create a funny story to tell at the local bars. And the police firmly believe that these two shipyard workers are just pulling a massive, coordinated hoax on the entire town. They believe it is a total joke, and they just need to find a way to make the men admit it. Now, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department has a very specific tool for dealing with liars. They have a small, windowless interrogation room in the very back of the station. It has concrete walls, a single fluorescent bulb, and a heavy wooden desk in the middle. And hidden completely out of sight, bolted to the underside of that desk behind a false wooden panel, is a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The detectives use this hidden machine all the time to record suspected murderers and thieves. The strategy is to put two suspects in the room together, tell them they are in massive trouble, and then leave them entirely alone. And once the cops walk out, the suspects almost always start whispering to each other, getting their stories straight, or laughing about the crime. And the hidden tape captures every single word. So Captain Ryder decides to use this exact trap on Charles and Calvin. Ryder grabs Charles, walks him down the hall, and shoves him into the hidden recorder room. Then he grabs the teenager Calvin and pushes him into the same room. Ryder stands in the doorway, glares at both of them, and tells them in a very harsh, threatening voice that filing a false police report is a serious crime. And they are both going to end up in a jail cell if they don't drop this ridiculous UFO act right now. Then Ryder reaches under the desk, blindly hits the record button on the machine, and quickly walks out of the room, slamming the heavy door shut behind him. The heavy metal lock clicks into place, and Ryder and the other deputies just stand out in the hallway, leaning against the wall. Drinking coffee and waiting, they are waiting for Charles to start laughing. They're waiting for Calvin to say something like, "We really fooled them, they totally bought it." They expect the hidden tape to capture the definitive proof of a stupid, harmless prank. But as the heavy reels of the tape recorder spin slowly in the dark underneath the desk, it does not capture a confession. It does not capture laughter or a coordinated lie. Instead, it captures the raw, unfiltered sounds of two men having a severe psychological breakdown. The tape picks up the sound of Calvin dragging his chair backward and collapsing heavily onto the floor. And then Calvin begins to sob. He weeps with these huge, ragged, gasping breaths that echo off the concrete walls. He says his arms are still completely numb. He says he thinks he is having a heart attack. He cries out that he just wants to go home to his family, and he begs Charles to get him a doctor. And the tape captures Charles pacing frantically back and forth across the small room, his heavy boots scuffing the floor, and Charles's voice is trembling violently. He keeps repeating over and over that he has been through the worst horrors of combat, but he has never seen anything like those gray things, and he has never been so deeply afraid in his entire life. The hidden tape continues to roll, and Calvin's panic escalates. He falls completely to his knees on the floor of the interrogation room, ignoring Charles completely, and he begins to pray aggressively. He screams out to God, begging for forgiveness, crying that he knows he is going to die tonight, and pleading for his soul to be saved. He sounds completely broken, like a teenager who has just looked over the edge of a cliff. And Charles stops pacing, kneels down next to him, and tries to comfort the boy, telling him, "I know, son. I know it was awful, but they had to know. We had to tell the authorities. There is absolutely no talk of a prank. There is no talk of getting famous. There is only the pure, undeniable sound of two completely ordinary men who are deeply, deeply traumatized by something they genuinely believe just happened to them." When Captain Ryder and the other deputies finally unlock the door and walk back into the room, 20 minutes later, they find Calvin curled into a tight fetal position on the hard floor, and Charles is sitting in a chair, staring completely, blankly at the far wall. The police pull the tape from the hidden machine and play it back in the main office. And as they listen to the weeping and the praying, a heavy, uncomfortable silence falls over the police station. And the detectives realize they were entirely wrong about their most basic assumption. These men were not drunk, and they were not pulling a hoax. Whatever happened on the banks of the Pascagoula River that night, these two men believed it with absolute, unwavering certainty. In the days following the incident, the story leaked from the police department to the local press, and it quickly became a massive global media sensation. The United States Air Force and independent scientific bodies subjected both Charles and Calvin to intense interrogations and rigorous polygraph tests, and both men passed perfectly, showing absolutely no signs of deception. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department kept the secret audio tape in their official evidence locker, preserving the raw recording of their panic. But the attention completely ruined their lives. Calvin Parker was so deeply affected by the event and the subsequent public mockery that he suffered severe nervous breakdowns, changed his name, and moved away, refusing to speak about the night for decades. Charles Hickson eventually wrote a book about the ordeal, but he never changed a single detail of his story. And both men went to their graves, swearing that they were taken aboard that ship. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for it. Because sometimes you survive an impossible ordeal, and you manage to make it back to safety, to tell your story to people who can protect you. But other times, when the worst happens, and you are left completely stranded and fighting for your life, there is no one waiting to listen. You are just completely abandoned in the middle of nowhere, waiting for a rescue that is never going to come. On a crisp Friday morning in October of 1973, the MV Blythe Star was sitting very low in the water at a busy commercial dock in Hobart, Tasmania. And Hobart is a deep-water port city located on the very southern edge of Australia. It is surrounded by thick, dark forests and jagged mountains, and it serves as a major hub for maritime shipping. And the Blythe Star was a coastal freighter that had been making the exact same supply runs up and down the coast for years. It was 144 feet long, and it was built out of thick, heavy steel, with a large white wheelhouse positioned at the very back of the ship, and a long, flat cargo deck stretching out toward the bow. And on this particular morning, the 10-man crew was loading the ship for a completely routine voyage. The cargo they were taking on was entirely ordinary. They were loading hundreds of tons of superphosphate fertilizer, which was essentially a heavy, dense powder packed into massive industrial sacks, along with a few wooden pallets of sealed beer kegs. And the men loading the ship were seasoned, hardened sailors who spent most of their lives out on the open water. They wore heavy canvas jackets and thick rubber boots to protect themselves from the constant freezing ocean spray. The captain of the vessel was a man named George Cruikshank, and he ran a very tight, highly organized ship. He knew exactly how much diesel fuel they had in the tanks, he knew exactly how the heavy cargo weight needed to be distributed in the lower hold, and he knew the location of every single piece of safety equipment on board. Now, inside the main wheelhouse, bolted directly to the metal control console, was the ship's primary high-frequency radio system. And this was a large, heavy piece of technology, with dozens of dials and a thick black microphone cable. It was specifically designed to broadcast an emergency distress signal across the entire Pacific Ocean. But this specific radio was hardwired directly into the ship's main electrical grid. So, it required the massive diesel engines deep in the lower hull to be actively running in order to generate enough power to push a strong signal out to the mainland Coast Guard stations. And as the crew finished tying down the last of the cargo chains, Captain Cruikshank checked the weather reports, signed the departure manifest, and gave the order to cast off the thick mooring lines. So the Blythe Star slowly pulled away from the concrete dock, navigated through the harbor, and headed out into the open ocean. And for the first few days of the trip, the conditions were absolutely ideal. They were sailing north through a body of water known as the Bass Strait. Now, the Bass Strait is notorious among sailors for being incredibly volatile, with unpredictable violent storms and massive rogue swells that can tear small fishing boats apart. But on this specific weekend, the water was practically glass. The sky was clear, the wind was very low, and the heavy steel freighter was making excellent time, so the crew fell right into their standard comfortable daily routine. The men who were not on active watch duty sat down in the small crew galley below the main deck. They drank hot tea from heavy ceramic mugs, they played card games on a sticky wooden table, and they listened to the low and video. Rhythmic thumping of the main engine vibrating through the steel floorboards. Everything about the voyage was completely standard. The ship was slicing smoothly through the dark blue water, and they were scheduled to arrive at their destination and offload the fertilizer in just a few days. But on the morning of October 12th, the everyday routine abruptly stopped. At roughly 8 o'clock in the morning, the ship is cruising steadily along the coast in perfectly calm waters. And suddenly, without any warning, and without hitting a reef or a rock in the water, the entire vessel violently jolts to the right. And it is not a slow, gradual tilt. The ship instantly drops into a severe 45-degree angle. Down in the galley, the wooden chairs slide aggressively across the linoleum floor and smash into the steel walls. The hot tea spills everywhere, and the resting crew members are thrown entirely out of their bunks and onto the hard floor. And before anyone can even stand up or brace themselves, the heavy steel hull begins groaning loudly under immense pressure, and cold seawater starts pouring rapidly into the lower compartments. The massive load of bagged fertilizer in the cargo hold had somehow shifted all at once, throwing the entire ship completely off balance. And because the cargo is so incredibly heavy, the ship cannot right itself. The deck of the Blythe Star is now permanently pitched downward, and the massive weight of the ocean is pulling the front of the ship directly under the surface. So the captain screams for everyone to abandon ship immediately. The men scramble frantically out of the galley, slipping on the wet metal stairs, and they force their way out onto the tilted exterior deck. And the situation is deteriorating in a matter of seconds. The back of the ship is rising high up into the air, exposing the large metal propellers. And the freezing water is already washing heavily over the main cargo doors. So the captain frantically climbs up the slanted floor of the wheelhouse, reaching for the large, high-frequency radio bolted to the console. He grabs the heavy black microphone to broadcast an immediate SOS to the Coast Guard, but when he presses the transmission button, absolutely nothing happens. The massive shift in the heavy cargo had instantly flooded the lower engine room completely, killing the ship's main generators. The heavy radio is completely dead. There is no backup battery, and there is no way to send a signal to the mainland. So the captain drops the microphone, slides back down the steep deck, and helps the crew deploy the single emergency life raft. It is a round, bright, orange inflatable rubber raft with a thin plastic canopy stretching over the top. The men throw it off the side of the sinking ship, and it instantly inflates on the surface of the water. One by one, the 10 sailors jump from the slanted steel deck into the freezing ocean and swim desperately toward the rubber raft. They grab the thick nylon ropes on the sides and pull themselves over the inflated tubes, piling into the small space. And less than 10 minutes after the initial jolt, the MV Blythe Star slips completely beneath the surface of the water, dragging hundreds of tons of cargo and steel down to the dark ocean floor. The water bubbles violently for a few seconds, swirling in a tight circle, and then it goes completely still. And the 10 men are left sitting shoulder to shoulder in a circular rubber raft that is essentially the size of a small dining room table, bobbing silently in the middle of the open ocean. They are completely soaked in freezing water, they have no heavy winter clothing, and they only have a few small tins of emergency drinking water and biscuits packed inside a pouch on the raft. But despite the extreme shock of losing their ship in a matter of minutes, the crew actually remains relatively calm as they sit in the water. And this is because they are operating on a very logical, widely accepted assumption. "We are right on the main shipping lane," the captain says. "They will notice we missed the check-in. Just conserve your energy and wait for the sun," he adds. The men firmly believe that because they are a massive commercial vessel on a designated route, Their absence will trigger an immediate response. They assume that within 24 hours, the sky above them will be completely filled with military helicopters and search planes, and a massive rescue boat will simply pluck them out of the water and take them home. So they just sit tight, huddle together for warmth, and wait for the rescue to begin. Now, normally, when a large commercial freighter suddenly disappears from the tracking boards, the maritime authorities launch a highly coordinated grid search. They take the ship's last known location, calculate the speed of the ocean currents, and draw a massive square on a map. Then they send military aircraft to fly back and forth across that specific square in a tight, overlapping pattern to ensure that absolutely nothing is missed. And that is exactly what the Australian government did. The moment the Blythe Star failed to arrive at port, the authorities launched the largest maritime search and rescue operation in the country's entire history up to that point. They deployed 14 military aircraft, dozens of commercial fishing boats, and heavy naval destroyers to scour the Bass Strait. And out on the water, the men in the raft can actually hear the massive search happening. On the second day adrift, a large 4-engine military search plane flies directly over their position. The men stand up in the wobbly rubber raft, waving their arms frantically and screaming at the top of their lungs, pointing at the bright orange canopy. But the plane just keeps flying in a perfectly straight line and disappears over the horizon. And the next day, another plane flies past them in the distance. And they wave their bright orange emergency paddles in the air, but the plane does not turn around. Because the heavy radio in the wheelhouse had lost power before the captain could send their exact coordinates, the military is searching completely the wrong grid. The massive fleet of rescue planes is looking for a 144-foot steel freighter floating near the planned route. They are not looking for a tiny orange rubber dot drifting aimlessly miles outside the designated search zone. And as the days drag on, the strong ocean currents grab the small raft and pull it further and further away from the shipping lanes. The weather turns violently cold, with heavy winds whipping across the open water. The men are constantly bailing freezing seawater out of the bottom of the raft with their bare hands to keep from sinking. Their skin becomes covered in thick, painfully raw saltwater sores, and their lips crack and bleed constantly from severe dehydration. They drink the last few drops of the emergency water on the 4th day, and then they have absolutely nothing. They try to catch small amounts of rainwater in the folds of the plastic canopy, but it is barely enough to wet their tongues. They sit in the raft for 3 days, then 5 days, then 7 days. And slowly, the brutal reality of their situation sets in. The military planes have completely stopped flying over them. The distant hum of boat engines is entirely gone. The massive military search operation has officially been called off due to a lack of evidence. The government has legally declared all 10 men dead, and the crew realizes that nobody is coming to save them. On the 8th day, adrift, the physical toll becomes too much for one of the men. A sailor named John Sloan has an underlying medical condition, and the total lack of medication and fresh water has completely destroyed his body. He stops speaking entirely. His breathing becomes incredibly shallow, and he quietly passes away in the corner of the raft. The remaining 9 men are simply too weak to lift his body over the inflated side, so they are forced to just leave him sitting there among them as they drift. The men are physically wasting away, their muscles cramping constantly, their vision blurring as they stare out at the endless horizon. They are completely at the mercy of the wind and the ocean, just waiting for their bodies to finally shut down. But on the 10th day, the current suddenly pushed the small rubber raft directly toward the rugged coastline of southern Tasmania. The men hear the loud crashing sound of heavy waves breaking against solid rock. The raft gets caught in the heavy surf spins, violently out of control, and is hurled onto a narrow stretch of sharp, jagged stones. The 9 surviving men crawl weakly over the rubber tubes and collapse onto the wet rocks. They have finally reached solid ground, but when they look around, they realize they have washed up in a place called Deep Glen Bay. And this is not a town or a port. It is a completely isolated, impenetrable stretch of harsh wilderness. The rocky beach is only a few yards wide, and towering directly behind it is a massive, nearly vertical cliff face covered in dense, incredibly thick jungle vegetation. There are no roads, there are no houses, and there is absolutely no way to walk along the jagged coast. They are completely trapped at the bottom of a massive stone wall. And for 2 of the men, the journey ends on those rocks. Their bodies are so completely depleted from starvation and exposure that they simply cannot stand up. They lay down on the cold stones and pass away just a few feet from the crashing water. So the remaining 7 men realize that if they stay on the beach, they will all die right there. They have to climb. The 7 survivors, wearing rags and completely barefoot, walk to the base of the towering cliff. They dig their bleeding fingers directly into the dirt and grab onto the thick, thorny roots of the jungle plants, and they slowly begin to pull themselves vertically up the stone face. It is an excruciatingly slow process. Every single muscle in their bodies is screaming in pain. "You gotta pull yourself up," one of the men says, reaching a hand down. "I can't feel my legs," another replies, gripping the roots. They slip constantly on the wet moss, sliding backward and scraping their skin on the sharp rock. But they absolutely refuse to stop. They pull each other up, step by agonizing step, hacking their way through the dense vegetation with their bare hands. After hours of brutal, relentless climbing, they finally crest the very top of the cliff. They stumble blindly through the thick brush, completely disoriented until they break through a line of trees and collapse onto a flat dirt surface. It is an old, unpaved logging road. And just a few hours later, a truck driver hauling timber comes around the bend and slams hard on his brakes when he sees 7 emaciated men sitting in the dirt. The survivors were rushed to the hospital, and the news of their sudden reappearance completely shocked the entire country. The Australian government was forced to heavily review their maritime protocols after realizing that their massive, incredibly expensive search operation had failed entirely. And because of the MV Blythe Star, new maritime laws were passed, requiring all commercial vessels to carry highly advanced emergency position indicating radio beacons that do not rely on the ship's internal power grid. The 7 men survived the sudden sinking, and they survived the open ocean, but they ultimately had to save themselves when the rest of the world stopped looking. They spent 10 brutal days drifting across a freezing ocean, completely exposed to the elements, praying for just a single drop of clean water. But sometimes, danger doesn't happen out in the wild. Sometimes it happens in highly refined, incredibly expensive environments, where the people involved think they are completely insulated from harm. In the early summer of 1973, the city of Bordeaux in southwestern France was widely considered the absolute, undisputed center of the global wine trade, and it had held this prestigious title for literally hundreds of years. So if you walk down the narrow, uneven cobblestone streets of the Chartrons district, which was the historic, wealthy neighborhood situated directly along the muddy banks of the massive Garonne River, you would see dozens of incredibly large ancient stone warehouses. And these heavily secured buildings were built directly into the waterfront. They belonged to the elite wine merchants of France, a tightly knit group of families who had completely controlled the export of Bordeaux wine for generations. And they were known locally as the Cork aristocracy. They had their own private social clubs, they sent their children to the same private boarding schools, and they essentially operated as a completely isolated social class. Now, the most powerful, the most respected, and the most financially successful of all these merchant families was the House of Cruz. And the entire company was completely controlled by 2 cousins named Lionel and Yvonne Cruz. They were men who had been born into a world of unimaginable wealth and social prestige. So they spent their days walking slowly through their massive, damp underground cellars, wearing custom-tailored suits and expensive leather shoes. And they would spend hours inspecting endless rows of heavy, iron-banded oak barrels that stretched out into the dark. And these 2 cousins were incredibly proud of their family heritage, which dated all the way back to the early 1800s. They knew the exact history of every single vineyard in the region. They knew exactly which patch of rocky dirt produced the best grapes. They knew exactly how much rain had fallen in any given season. And they knew the exact temperature required to ferment the perfect barrel of wine. And their daily routine was incredibly precise and highly ritualized. Every single morning, Lionel and Yvonne would walk into a private, heavily guarded tasting room lined with large glass windows. They would stand by a long wooden table, and they would pull small, carefully measured samples of wine from various wooden casks. They would hold the thin glass up to the sunlight coming through the window to check the exact shade and clarity of the deep red liquid. And then they would take a slow, calculated sip. They would let the liquid sit on their tongues for a few seconds, analyze the complex flavor profile, and then turn and spit the wine into heavy, ornate silver buckets resting on the floor. And sitting right on the corner of the heavy wooden desk in that exact same tasting room was a tall, very neat stack of paper invoices. Now, these invoices were officially stamped by various industrial supply companies, and they detailed massive bulk orders of synthetic acids, industrial chemical dyes, and heavy liquid compounds. And the papers were just sitting there in the open, completely unsecured. And if an outside visitor or a low-level employee ever pointed to the stack and asked about the heavy chemical orders, the senior floor managers would just wave a hand dismissively. They would explain that running a massive, centuries-old wine cellar was an incredibly dirty job, and they required very harsh industrial-grade chemicals to thoroughly clean the wooden vats, scrub the thick mold off the stone walls, and sanitize the damp floors. So the papers just sat there on the desk, completely ignored by the dozens of people walking past them every single day. The chemical orders were just considered a completely normal, boring part of the warehouse maintenance. But outside of those quiet, dark tasting rooms, the global wine market was completely losing its mind. In 1972 and early 1973, a massive global economic shift had created an unprecedented, almost hysterical demand for high-end French wine. There was high inflation across the globe, and foreign currencies were fluctuating wildly. So wealthy investment bankers, foreign business tycoons, and international art collectors in the United States and Great Britain stopped putting their money into standard stocks, and they started buying up hundreds of thousands of cases of vintage Bordeaux. And they were doing this blindly treating the heavy wooden wine crates exactly like gold bullion. They were buying the wine purely as a financial investment, locking it away in secure, temperature-controlled vaults without ever actually opening a single bottle. So the prices for a single bottle of Bordeaux skyrocketed practically overnight. And because they were the biggest and most famous merchant in the region, the House of Cruz was suddenly receiving massive multi-million-dollar orders from these frantic overseas buyers on a daily basis. But there was a very serious, completely unavoidable physical problem with this sudden surge in demand. Bordeaux is a heavily regulated, geographically limited agricultural region. You cannot just build a new factory and manufacture more grapes on a whim. The weather entirely dictates the harvest, and the ancient vines only produce a very specific, limited amount of fruit each year. And 1972 had been a particularly terrible year for the weather in France, resulting in a very small, highly acidic harvest. So there was simply not enough legitimate Bordeaux wine in existence to fulfill the massive orders that were pouring into the Chartrons district. The House of Cruz was facing intense daily pressure from their international clients to ship out wine that they simply did not possess. Now, the French government maintains a very aggressive, highly specialized, and deeply feared department specifically dedicated to regulating commercial taxes and consumer fraud within the agricultural sector. And in June of 1973, a quiet, anonymous tip landed on the desk of a senior tax inspector in Paris. The tip did not mention the elite House of Cruz or any of the wealthy aristocratic families in Bordeaux. Instead, it pointed directly to a much smaller, relatively unknown, and very blue-collar wine broker named Pierre Bert. And the anonymous informant claimed that Bert was suddenly moving a highly suspicious, massive amount of cheap table wine out of the Languedoc region. Now, Languedoc is a dry, blisteringly hot agricultural area in the deep south of France, and it was widely known for producing very harsh, very bitter, extremely low-quality grapes. The wine from this region was typically just pumped into massive metal tanker trucks, sold for absolute pennies, and dispensed into cheap plastic jugs for local factory workers to drink with lunch. It was heavily regarded as the lowest quality wine in the entire country. So, a small team of state tax inspectors quietly traveled down to the south of France and began aggressively digging through Pierre Bert's physical shipping manifests and tax ledgers. And they immediately noticed a massive, glaring discrepancy in his paperwork. Bert was legally buying millions of liters of this cheap, bitter, low-quality wine from the southern farmers. But he had absolutely no record of selling that cheap wine to grocery stores or local taverns. Instead, his official trucking logs showed that his massive delivery tankers were driving straight north, directly into the heart of the elite Bordeaux region. And this completely confused the tax inspectors, because the most basic, a foundational assumption of the entire French wine industry was that the elite, wealthy houses of Bordeaux were completely insulated from the lower-class agricultural markets. The international experts, the highly paid critics, and the master buyers firmly believed that their highly trained palates were essentially biological laboratories. They confidently stated in magazines that if even a single drop of cheap Southern wine touched their tongues, they would instantly detect the fraud and spit it out on the floor. They believed the elite system was totally impenetrable. So the tax inspectors assumed they were just looking at a low-level paperwork error, or maybe a minor localized tax evasion scheme where a small-time broker was hiding his inventory. They absolutely did not believe that the cheap, bitter wine from the South was actually entering the high-end, multi-million-dollar supply chain. They thought it was physically impossible to fool the global market. But the tax inspectors were required by law to follow the paper trail wherever it led. And the shipping documents from Pierre Bert's heavy trucks led them directly to the heavy iron-wrought front gates of the House of Cruz. So, on a quiet weekday morning, a large fleet of black government cars abruptly pulled up to the cobblestone waterfront. Dozens of state inspectors carrying heavy leather briefcases walked straight past the front desk, completely ignoring the protests of the receptionists, and marched directly down the stone stairs into the massive, echoing cellars. And Lionel and Yvonne Cruz were immediately silently in the damp hallways. The government agents began physically auditing the massive oak vats using long metal dipsticks to measure the exact volume of liquid sitting in the cellars. Then they checked those physical measurements against the official legally declared harvest records of the local Bordeaux vineyards. And the numbers did not match even a little bit. The House of Cruz had millions of liters of wine sitting in their vats that officially, legally did not exist. So the lead tax inspector walked away from the vats and walked straight into the private tasting room with the large glass windows. He looked at the heavy silver spittoons resting on the floor. He walked over to the heavy wooden desk, and he picked up the neat stack of paper invoices sitting right on the corner. "What are these chemicals used for?" the inspector asked. "They are strictly for cleaning the cellars," the floor manager replied quickly. "We use them to sanitize the stone floors." "They are delivered in very large quantities," the inspector noted. "It is a very large cellar," the manager said. But the inspector did not put the papers down. He looked at the exact dates stamped on the chemical orders. He cross-referenced the dates of the chemical deliveries with the exact arrival times of Pierre Bert's tanker trucks from the south. He realized they were arriving at the exact same time. He ordered a team of state chemists to immediately pull liquid samples directly from the most expensive, highly rated, ready-to-ship vats in the Cruz cellar. The chemists packed the vials into secure cases, drove them to Paris, and ran the deep red liquid through strict, highly advanced laboratory tests. And the final chemical results completely shattered the entire foundation of the global wine market. Because the heavy industrial chemicals listed on those invoices were not used for cleaning the stone floors, they were used to fundamentally alter the chemistry of cheap Southern wine. The House of Cruz, facing impossible pressure from the global market, had been quietly buying incredibly harsh, nearly undrinkable wine for absolute pennies. They were pumping that cheap liquid into their elite oak vats, and then they were actively mixing it with synthetic acids, industrial coloring dyes, and heavy chemical compounds. They were using sulfuric acid to kill off the wild yeast and stop premature fermentation. They were using specific synthetic dyes to mimic the exact deep purple hue of a mature vintage. And they were adding heavy processed sugar to entirely mask the harsh acidic bite of the cheap Languedoc grapes. They were chemically engineering cheap, low-grade table wine in the dark to perfectly mimic the exact flavor profile of rare Bordeaux. And then they were slapping their prestigious, centuries-old family labels on the glass bottles and selling them to wealthy foreigners for massive, life-changing fortunes. The revelation that the greatest wine experts, the most refined critics, and the wealthiest collectors in the entire world had been happily drinking cheap, heavily dyed, chemically altered table wine caused an immediate, massive, international scandal. The American and British markets completely panicked. Wealthy buyers, realizing their expensive investments were essentially worthless. Artificially colored liquid canceled tens of millions of dollars in outstanding orders practically overnight. The sudden, massive wave of cancellations caused the entire economy of the Bordeaux region to completely collapse. The prices of high-end wine plummeted into the ground, devastating the local farmers and the honest merchants who had completely relied on the region's pristine reputation. And in 1974, Lionel and Yvonne Cruz, along with Pierre Bert and several other lower-level brokers, were formally put on trial in a highly publicized, incredibly crowded courtroom in Bordeaux. The Cruz cousins stood before the judge and heavily defended their family name. They tried to argue that blending different wines was a historic, completely acceptable practice in the region. They insisted they only did it to meet the impossible, frantic demands of the foreign markets, and they claimed that nobody was physically hurt by the altered wine. But the judge was entirely unmoved by their wealth or their aristocratic legacy. He saw their actions as a calculated, deliberate destruction of the country's most valuable cultural export. The court handed down severe, highly damaging convictions for massive commercial fraud. Lionel and Yvonne Cruz received 1-year suspended prison sentences and were ordered to pay millions of francs in crushing financial penalties. The House of Cruz, a company that had stood as an untouchable pillar of wealth, trust, and prestige for over 150 years, was completely devastated. The family's reputation was destroyed, and they were eventually forced to sell off their most prized historic vineyards just to survive the massive financial fallout. And in direct response to the massive embarrassment of the scandal, the French government completely rewrote the appellation d'origine contrôlée laws. They implemented incredibly strict, state-monitored tracking systems that follow the grapes from the exact moment they are picked off the vine to the exact moment the cork goes into the glass bottle. The elite class of Bordeaux had essentially built a massive global empire on the absolute trust of the public, only to watch that empire completely vanish into thin air in a matter of days. But sometimes it doesn't take days for something incredibly precious to disappear. Sometimes you look away for just 5 seconds, and your entire world is gone forever. On Monday, June 12, 1972, Murray McNaughton was standing in the kitchen of his home in the town of Arnprior, Ontario. And Arnprior was a very blue-collar, hard-working community situated right on the edge of the Ottawa River in Canada. It was a place where people worked in massive lumber mills. They worked in heavy agriculture. And they generally spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. So everyone in the town knew exactly who their neighbors were. And Murray was a very dedicated, highly practical man who worked incredibly hard to support his very large family. He was married, and he and his wife had several young children running around their wooden frame house. And having that many kids in a small space meant the house was constantly loud, chaotic, and heavily demanding on his wife. So on this particular Monday afternoon, the weather was starting to get warm, and the short Canadian summer was finally beginning. And Murray decided he wanted to get the kids out of the house for a few hours just to give his wife a quiet break to herself. So he walked into the living room and gathered 3 of his children, including his 5-year-old son, Adrian. And Adrian was a very small, energetic boy with light blonde hair. He was wearing a bright blue nylon windbreaker jacket, a pair of brown shorts, and small rubber-soled running shoes. So Murray packed the 3 boys into the family car, loaded several long fiberglass fishing poles into the trunk, and grabbed a small plastic tackle box. And he told the boys they were going to drive out into the country to do some afternoon fishing. Now, they were not going to a manicured public park with paved walking trails and concrete boat ramps. They were driving out to a place called Holmes Lake, which was located roughly an hour away, deep inside the rugged, heavily forested wilderness near the town of Calabogie. And to get there, Murray had to drive his car off the main paved highway and navigate down a series of very narrow, heavily rutted dirt logging roads. And the environment surrounding Holmes Lake was completely wild and totally unmanaged. The lake itself was a small, dark body of water surrounded by dense, nearly impenetrable crown land. There were thousands of thick pine trees pressing right up against the muddy shoreline, and the water was heavily choked with fallen, rotting deadwood and thick weeds. It was a very rough, isolated place. And it was widely known as a spot where local men would go to catch small panfish and trout. So Murray drove his car carefully over the deep potholes in the dirt road and finally pulled into a small, grassy clearing near the edge of the lake. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, and the 4 of them got out into the warm afternoon air. And the area was totally deserted. There were no other cars parked in the clearing, and there was absolutely no sign of any other fishermen on the water. So Murray popped the trunk, handed the long fishing poles to his sons, and grabbed the small plastic tackle box. And they walked single file down a very narrow, muddy footpath that cut directly through the dense brush. They walked about 50 yards from the parked car until they reached the immediate edge of the lake. The bank was very steep, totally covered in exposed tree roots, and the ground was incredibly soft and wet. So Murray found a small, relatively flat patch of dirt right next to the water, and he instructed the boys to stand there. He opened his tackle box, pulled out a few small metal hooks, and began tying them to the end of the clear fishing lines. And Adrian was holding a very small, lightweight rod designed for a child. So Murray baited the small hook, attached a red and white plastic round bobber to the line, and handed the pole back to his 5-year-old son. And the three boys spread out slightly along the muddy bank and cast their lines out into the dark water. And for a few minutes, everything was completely normal. The boys were watching their brightly colored bobbers floating on the surface, and Murray was standing just a few feet behind them, keeping a close eye on the water and making sure nobody slipped down the steep bank. But almost immediately, Adrian ran into a problem. Because he was very young and relatively inexperienced, he had cast his line a bit too close to a large submerged log resting just beneath the surface of the water. And the small metal hook snagged heavily on the rotting wood. So Adrian pulled hard on the thin fiberglass rod, trying to yank the hook free. But instead of breaking loose, the sudden tension caused the spinning reel on his rod to completely malfunction. The thin, clear, monofilament line rapidly unspooled and knotted itself into a massive, complicated bird's nest of tangled plastic string around the metal gears, and Adrian became visibly frustrated. He lowered the tip of the rod completely, unable to reel the line in or pull the hook free. So Murray saw his son struggling and walked over to him. "Just hold on a second, let me fix it," Murray says. He reaches down and takes the small rod directly out of Adrian's hands. And Murray realizes that the tangle in the reel is incredibly tight. So he turns his body slightly away from the bright glare of the water facing the dark green tree line so he can see the thin, clear line better against a dark background. And Adrian, no longer holding his fishing pole, just takes a few steps away. He walks a few feet along the muddy shoreline right near the edge of the water to look for rocks or play with the sticks laying in the dirt, and Murray stands there completely focused on the mechanical issue in his hands. He uses his thumbnails to pick apart a stubborn, tight knot in the thin, clear nylon fishing line. He pulls a small loop through the metal guide, untwists the plastic string, and slowly works the complicated tangle out of the reel. And the entire process of fixing the knot takes him no more than 10 seconds. He finally snaps the last loop free, turns the handle to reel in the slack, and turns around to hand the pole back to his son. But Adrian is not standing on the bank. Murray looks to his left, expecting to see the bright blue windbreaker standing near a bush, but there is nothing there. He looks to his right toward where his other two sons are still quietly watching their bobbers in the water. And Adrian is not with them. "Adrian, where did you go?" Murray says. There is absolutely no answer. The only sound is the low wind moving through the upper canopy of the pine trees and the very faint lapping of the water against the mud. So, Murray sets the fishing pole down in the dirt. He takes a few quick steps toward the exact spot where Adrian had just been standing 5 seconds earlier. He looks down at the ground, assuming the boy might have crouched down behind a large tree stump. But the space behind the stump is completely empty. "Adrian, come back here," Murray says, his voice much louder this time. He turns to his older sons. "Did you see where he went?" Murray asks. The older boys just shake their heads. They had been completely focused on their own fishing lines and had not looked away from the water. So Murray's heart immediately starts to race. He knows that the brush surrounding the lake is incredibly dense, and a small child could easily get turned around and lost if they wandered even a few feet off the main path. He runs up the narrow dirt trail, moving away from the water and heading directly toward the grassy clearing where the car is parked. He assumes Adrian just got bored and walked back to wait by the vehicle. But when he breaks through the tree line and looks at the parked car, the clearing is totally empty. Adrian is not sitting on the bumper, and he is not standing in the grass. "I'm going to look by the car," one of the older brothers yells from down by the water. "He's not up here!" Murray yells back, panic fully setting into his chest. Murray runs back into the thick brush. He begins tearing frantically through the heavy bushes, completely ignoring the sharp thorns tearing at his clothes. He runs in a wide, erratic circle around the immediate shoreline, screaming his son's name at the absolute top of his lungs. He spends a full desperate hour destroying the brush, checking behind every massive tree trunk, and staring down into the dark, murky water near the shore. But there is absolutely no sign of the bright blue jacket. There is no sound of crying. There is nothing. So Murray runs back to the muddy bank, grabs his other two sons, and forces them to run up the trail to the car. He throws them into the back seat, starts the engine, and drives at absolute top speed down the heavily rutted dirt logging road, desperate to find a telephone. He finally reaches a small house miles away on the main road and immediately calls the Ontario Provincial Police. Now, normally when police receive a frantic dispatch call about a young child wandering away in a rural forested area, they operate on a very specific foundational assumption. The police assume that a 5-year-old boy with very short legs and small shoes simply cannot travel very far or very fast through extremely dense, unbroken wilderness. The thick underbrush acts as a natural physical barrier, and they also assume that a small child walking aimlessly through a wet, muddy environment will leave highly visible, undeniable physical tracks. They expect to find small footprints pressed deep into the soft dirt. They expect to find freshly snapped branches where the child pushed through the bushes, and they expect to find dropped items like a small shoe pulled off by the thick mud, or a bright piece of clothing caught on a heavy thorn. So, the responding officers drive straight out to Holmes Lake with total confidence that this will be a very short, highly successful search and rescue mission. They arrive at the grassy clearing walk down the narrow path and stand on the exact spot where Murray last saw his son. And they immediately set up a standard grid search, expecting to find the child sitting against a tree just a few hundred yards away, probably crying and covered in bug bites. But as the police slowly fan out into the woods, walking shoulder to shoulder and scanning the ground with heavy flashlights, they find absolutely nothing. The soft, wet mud, directly adjacent to where Adrian was standing, is entirely undisturbed. There are no small footprints leading away from the water. There are no broken twigs. There are no scuff marks on the exposed tree roots. By nightfall, the news of the missing boy reaches the town of Arnprior, and hundreds of local civilian volunteers leave their homes, drive their trucks down the dirt logging roads, and completely flood the area around Holmes Lake. They form massive, sweeping human chains. The men link their arms and walk methodically through the pitch-black forest, using heavy, battery-powered lanterns to illuminate every single inch of the forest floor. They yell Adrian's name in unison, stopping every few minutes to listen in complete silence for a response. But the woods remain totally quiet. The next morning, the scale of the operation expands massively. The Ontario Provincial Police officially request assistance from the Canadian Armed Forces. Dozens of military personnel and heavy trucks arrive at the lake. They set up a massive command tent in the clearing. Military helicopters are deployed, flying incredibly low over the tops of the pine trees, using the powerful downdraft of their rotors to push the branches aside, while spotters look for any flash of bright blue nylon. And down on the ground, the police bring in highly trained tracking dogs. The handlers take a piece of unwashed clothing straight from Adrian's bedroom in Arnprior and hold it directly in front of the dogs' noses. The massive bloodhounds lock onto the scent, drop their heads to the dirt, and pull hard on their heavy leather leashes. They track the scent directly from the parked car, straight down the narrow path, and they walk right to the exact spot on the muddy bank where Adrian was standing. And then the dogs simply stop. They sit down in the wet dirt, look up at their handlers, and begin to whine. They completely lose the scent trail right at the edge of the water, and they absolutely refuse to walk into the surrounding brush. So the police completely shift their focus. They assume that because there are no tracks leading into the woods, the boy must have slipped on the wet roots, fallen backward into the lake, and drowned. So a team of highly specialized police divers is deployed into Holmes Lake, and the water is freezing cold, and the visibility beneath the surface is absolute zero. The divers have to feel their way along the bottom using entirely their bare hands. They crawl through the thick, heavy mud, reaching around massive, rotting tree trunks and sharp rocks. They search the entire underwater drop-off near the shore, and then they expand their grid spending days, systematically dragging heavy metal hooks across the bottom of the entire lake. But they pull up absolutely nothing. Days turn into weeks. The search for Adrian McNaughton becomes one of the largest, most expensive, and most heavily publicized rescue operations in Canadian history. Thousands of man-hours are spent physically tearing the forest apart. They even bring in heavy industrial water pumps and completely drain several small ponds in the surrounding area just to check the mud at the bottom. But as the senior investigators sit in the command tent and review the exact timeline of events, they realize they are dealing with a complete physical impossibility. Murray McNaughton had his back turned away from his son for a maximum of 10 seconds. And in that incredibly tiny window of time, a 5-year-old child completely vanished from the physical world. If Adrian had slipped on the mud and fallen into the dark water of the lake, he would have splashed heavily. He would have screamed in shock, and the divers would have easily found his body tangled in the underwater debris. But there was no splash, and the water was empty. If he had walked into the dense forest, he could not have moved fast enough to outrun the massive human chains. The tracking dogs would have easily followed his path, and he would have left a shoe or a piece of his bright blue jacket behind. But there were no tracks, and there was no clothing. And if someone had driven a vehicle down the isolated logging road and forcefully taken him, Murray would have easily heard the heavy crunch of car tires moving over the gravel, or he would have heard his son yell for help. But the clearing was entirely empty, and there was absolutely no sound. And if you recall that stubborn knot in the clear nylon fishing line that Murray was picking at with his thumbnails, that tiny, frustrating tangle was not just a minor inconvenience on a family trip, it was the exact impossible window of time that swallowed the boy permanently. The very few seconds it took to clear that thin plastic string was the only margin required for a child to cease to exist. The massive official search operation was eventually called off due to a total lack of physical evidence. Murray McNaughton and his wife lived the rest of their lives completely broken by the sheer lack of answers, forever haunted by the few seconds on the bank of that lake. To this day, the Ontario Provincial Police still classify the disappearance as an open, active cold case. But in the more than 50 years that have passed since 1972, absolutely no trace of Adrian McNaughton has ever been discovered. Not a single bone, not a small running shoe, not a torn shred of blue nylon. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for it. Because sometimes a person simply ceases to exist in the middle of a vast, empty wilderness, leaving behind absolutely nothing but the silent trees. But other times, a person meets a deeply violent end, right in the middle of a heavily populated city locked securely inside their own home, leaving behind a very deliberate message on the wall. On a cold, overcast Wednesday morning in November of 1972, a young woman named Amala Ruth de Vere Whelan was living in the Maida Vale district of London. And Maida Vale was a very residential, highly sought-after neighborhood located in the western part of the city. It was known for its wide, tree-lined streets, its massive Victorian mansions that had been carved up into smaller apartments, and its quiet, leafy public squares. And Amala was 22 years old, and she was an incredibly independent, very driven young woman. She had recently secured a job working in the city center, and she spent her days navigating the busy London Underground, surrounded by thousands of rushing commuters. But in her free time, she was heavily involved in the local social scene. She spent her evenings meeting friends at local pubs, visiting independent art galleries, and exploring the sprawling city. So she had a very wide circle of acquaintances. She was constantly out and about, and she was widely considered to be a very vibrant, energetic person who was just starting to build a successful life for herself in the capital. And as a major step in building that life, she had just recently signed a lease and moved into a ground-floor flat on Randolph Avenue. Now, living completely alone on the ground floor in a massive city comes with inherent risks, and Amala was very careful about her personal security. Her flat was situated in a large, heavy stone building, and her specific unit had a very thick wooden front door fitted with a solid brass deadbolt lock. The large sash windows looking out onto the street were heavily reinforced, and she made it a strict personal habit to keep them tightly shut and locked from the inside every single time she came home. So she felt completely insulated from the noise, the weather, and the crowds of central London whenever she was inside her home. And since she had only been living in this specific apartment on Randolph Avenue for about 3 weeks, she was still in the very slow, tedious process of unpacking her boxes and arranging her furniture. So the flat was slightly cluttered, but it had a very cozy, lived-in feel. There were tall stacks of hardback books resting on the wooden floorboards. There were winter clothes draped over the backs of wooden chairs in the bedroom, and she had various small items scattered across the flat as she decided where to put them. And sitting right on a small wooden table in the main living room was a standard metal aerosol spray can. It was just a totally ordinary, mass-produced, cylindrical can, sitting perfectly upright, next to a few scattered papers and a coffee mug. And anyone who walked into the room would have just assumed she had left it out after doing some quick cleaning, or maybe she was using it for a small art project or minor repair while settling into the new space. It completely blended in with the general clutter of moving. Now, for several days in early November, the weather in London was particularly wet, gray, and miserable. The streets were slick with freezing rain, and most people were hurrying straight home from work to sit by their heaters. And Amala had made plans to meet up with a few of her friends for a drink at a local pub in the neighborhood. But when the time came for them to meet, she simply did not show up. And initially, her friends were not terribly worried. They assumed she had just gotten tied up at work, or maybe she had looked out the window at the freezing rain and decided to stay inside her warm flat for the night. But a few days went by and nobody had heard a single word from her. She was not answering the telephone in her flat. She was not responding to messages, and she had not been seen walking down Randolph Avenue or stopping by the local shops. So by the morning of November 12th, a few of her closest friends started to feel a very persistent, nagging sense of concern. And they knew she was a very reliable person who would not just disappear or break plans without telling anyone where she was going. So a few people decided to walk over to her building on Randolph Avenue just to knock on her door and make sure she was not suffering from a severe flu or stuck in bed. They walked up the short concrete path, stood on the front step of the building, and knocked heavily on her thick wooden door. But there was absolutely no answer from inside. The hallway was completely silent, and they stepped back and looked at her specific windows. They noticed that the thick fabric curtains over the front windows were pulled completely shut, blocking any view into the living room, and there were no lights shining through the gaps. So they knocked again, much louder, this time hitting the wood with their knuckles and calling out her name. But the flat remained entirely quiet. And this was completely out of character for Amala. So they contacted the local property manager who lived nearby and held the master keys for the building, and they asked him to come over immediately and check on her welfare. The manager arrives a short time later carrying a heavy metal ring of keys on his belt. He knocks on the door one more time, leaning his ear against the wood just to be absolutely sure she isn't calling out for help. And then he slides his heavy master key into the brass lock. He turns it with a loud click, pushes the heavy wooden door open, and steps inside the dark flat. The air inside the apartment is incredibly stale, smelling faintly of dust and old fabric, and the hallway is completely silent. The manager calls out Amala's name, loudly echoing off the plaster walls, but there is no response. He walks slowly down the short central hallway, stepping carefully past a few unpacked cardboard boxes, and he turns into the main living room. And lying directly in the center of the wooden floor is Amala. She is not moving. Her clothes are completely torn and her face and arms are heavily bruised. And wrapped incredibly tightly around her neck, pulled into a deep, highly restrictive knot, is a dark nylon stocking. The manager stares at the scene for a fraction of a second, immediately backs out of the room, runs frantically out the front door into the street, and calls the Metropolitan Police. Within minutes, New Scotland Yard detectives and uniformed officers arrive at the flat with their sirens blaring and completely secure the entire building. They string up heavy police tape, push the gathering crowds back from the sidewalk, and begin processing the scene. And normally, when police get a dispatch call about a violent physical assault and murder in a residential ground floor apartment, they operate on a very basic, established assumption. They assume that a violent stranger completely kicked the front door off its hinges, or they shattered a ground floor window with a heavy brick to gain access from the street. So the forensic teams immediately start dusting the heavy wooden doorframe for foreign fingerprints, checking the heavy metal hinges for structural damage, and looking for broken glass on the carpet. But the detectives quickly realized they were totally wrong about their most basic assumption. The heavy brass lock on the front door was completely intact, and there were absolutely no pry marks or scratches on the wood to indicate a lockpick or a crowbar. The large sash windows were all securely locked from the inside. The latches were fully engaged, and the glass was totally pristine. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry anywhere in the entire flat, and this specific undeniable detail completely changes the direction of the entire investigation, because it means the killer did not break in through brute force. Amala was a very security-conscious woman, living in a new area, so there had to be a reasonable explanation for why the door was open. She either knew the man personally and willingly unlocked the door to invite him inside, or a stranger had knocked on her door and offered a highly reasonable, completely non-threatening explanation for being there. The stranger might have claimed to be a maintenance worker checking the pipes or a neighbor needing help manipulating her into unlocking the deadbolt without a struggle. So the detectives launch a massive, incredibly aggressive canvass of the entire Maida Vale neighborhood. They start knocking on doors up and down Randolph Avenue, interviewing hundreds of residents, asking the neighbors if they heard any screaming, any loud crashes, or any unfamiliar voices coming from the ground floor flat in the days leading up to the discovery. But nobody heard a single thing. The heavy brick walls of the Victorian building and the constant ambient noise of the London traffic had completely muffled any sound from inside the apartment. So the police pivot their strategy and track down every single person listed in Amala's address book. They bring in her close friends, her coworkers from the city center, her former boyfriends, and even the men she casually spoke to at the local pubs over the past few weeks. They put these men in small, windowless interrogation rooms at New Scotland Yard and aggressively check their alibis. They focus heavily on one particular man who was known to frequent the same pubs as Amala and had shown a strong romantic interest in her. They sit across from him and demand to know exactly where he was on the specific nights in question. They push him hard, looking for any inconsistencies in his story. But every single man they interview, including the pub regular, has a perfectly solid, highly verified reason for his whereabouts. The pub regular was working a late shift at a local factory, and his punched time card and the testimony of his manager proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Another man was completely out of town, visiting his family in the countryside. Nobody has fresh scratches on their arms or face. Nobody was seen acting suspiciously in the neighborhood, and absolutely nobody has a clear financial or personal motive to brutally harm a 22-year-old woman who had just moved into the area. The detectives are completely stonewalled. They have a victim, they have a secure flat, but they do not have a single viable suspect to arrest. But back at the flat on Randolph Avenue, the crime scene investigators are slowly and methodically working their way through the living room. They use heavy flashlights to illuminate the dark corners. They photograph the heavy furniture, they document the exact position of the torn clothing on the floor, and they carefully catalog every single item resting in the room. And then they step back and look up at the main plaster wall of the living room directly above where Amala was found. And if you recall, that standard metal aerosol spray can sitting perfectly upright on the small wooden table, that can was not a household cleaner, and she had not left it out while unpacking her boxes. The killer had deliberately brought it with him in his pocket, or he had found it sitting in the flat during the attack. And after he brutally strangled her with the nylon stocking, he did not just drop the weapon and run away into the street in a blind panic. He walked calmly over to the table, picked up the metal can, and stood directly over her body. He pressed his gloved finger down on the plastic nozzle, and he used the aerosol spray to write a single massive word across the wallpaper. He sprayed the word Ripper. The detectives stood in the living room and stared at the massive, dripping letters on the wall in total silence. They realized that they were not just dealing with a random crime of passion or a burglary gone wrong. They were hunting a highly calculated, deeply dangerous predator who felt completely comfortable staying inside the locked flat long after the murder was finished. He was actively taunting the police, leaving a deliberate signature at the scene and directly comparing himself to the most infamous, unidentified serial killer in British history. The Metropolitan Police threw massive resources at the case in the months and years that followed. They conducted over 1,000 individual interviews, took hundreds of official written statements, and followed up on every single minor tip that came into the station. They carefully preserved key pieces of physical evidence from the flat, sealing the torn clothing and the stocking in sterile paper bags and placing them in deep, cold storage, hoping that future scientific technology would eventually catch up to the killer. And decades later, forensic scientists at New Scotland Yard actually pulled those exact evidence bags out of storage. Using highly advanced modern DNA extraction techniques that did not exist in 1972, they were actually able to isolate a full, complete DNA profile from the physical, biological evidence left by the killer at the scene. They ran that specific profile through massive national and international criminal databases, fully expecting the computer to finally match it to a known violent offender sitting in a prison somewhere. But the computer returned absolutely zero matches. The DNA profile did not exist in any law enforcement system in the world. The man who walked into Amala's flat killed her, and painted that word on the wall simply vanished into the sprawling city of London. He was never identified, he was never interviewed, and he was never arrested. and to this day, they do not have an explanation for who he was or where he went. A heavy wooden door and a solid brass lock in Maida Vale were not enough to keep a phantom out of a ground floor flat. But sometimes even the most robust security in a highly populated building cannot protect you when you close your eyes to sleep. On a quiet Sunday morning in September of 1972, a 68-year-old woman named Emmy Werner was staying at the Queen's Hotel in the Bayswater district of London. And Bayswater was a very affluent, bustling neighborhood located just north of Hyde Park in the western part of the city. It was a place lined with these massive, white stucco Victorian townhouses that had been heavily renovated and converted into luxury hotels and private upscale residences. And the Queen's Hotel itself was a very established, highly respectable place to stay. It had a large front lobby with heavy velvet curtains pulled back from the tall windows, a long mahogany reception desk running along the back wall, and staff members wearing crisp, tailored uniforms who stood by the heavy glass front doors to greet the guests as they walked in from the street. So, it was exactly the kind of place where wealthy tourists, international business travelers, and older individuals felt incredibly secure. And Emmy was exactly that kind of guest. She was a woman who deeply appreciated strict routine, absolute quiet, and the feeling of total safety. But her intense need for security and predictability was not just a quirk of her personality or a product of her old age. It was born out of a very dark, incredibly heavy past that she carried with her every single day. Because Emmy was originally from Central Europe and she was a survivor of the Holocaust. And during the Second World War, decades before she ever set foot in a luxury hotel in London, she had been subjected to the absolute worst horrors of the 20th century. She had been forcibly removed from her home by the military, stripped of all her personal belongings, and placed directly into the brutal concentration camp system. And inside those camps, she had been subjected to systemic starvation, freezing temperatures, and grueling forced labor. But far worse than the physical toll was the psychological destruction she was forced to endure. She had watched almost her entire extended family be systematically murdered. She had seen the people she loved most in the world simply taken away and never returned, leaving her completely isolated in a world that was actively trying to kill her. But somehow, against all physical and statistical odds, Emmy had survived the camps. She had endured the freezing winters in thin clothing, she had survived the rampant disease that swept through the wooden barracks, and she had outlasted the constant daily threat of execution until the camps were finally liberated by the Allied forces. And after the war finally ended, she was essentially forced to start her entire life over from absolute scratch with nothing but the clothes on her back. So she had moved away from the smoking ruins of Europe. She had worked incredibly hard, and she had slowly and methodically built a new, very quiet life for herself. She eventually got married, she saved her money meticulously, and she found a way to simply exist in the civilized world again. She locked away the trauma of the camps and focused entirely on creating a peaceful environment for her twilight years. And by 1972, she was 68 years old, and she was simply trying to enjoy her life. So she had traveled to London for a short, relaxing holiday. And she had chosen the Queen's Hotel specifically because it was heavily staffed. It was located in a very safe neighborhood, and it provided a level of comfort that she deeply valued. And her daily routine at the hotel was incredibly predictable. She would wake up early in the morning, get dressed in very neat, carefully pressed clothing, and walk down the wide, heavily carpeted stairs to the main dining room on the ground floor. She would sit at a small round table by the window, drink a single cup of black tea, and quietly read the morning newspapers while watching the London traffic roll by outside. And the hotel staff quickly grew to recognize her face. The waiters knew exactly how she liked her toast prepared, and the front desk clerks would always smile and say good morning as she walked slowly through the busy lobby. She was just a very quiet, polite older woman who kept entirely to herself and never caused any trouble. And after breakfast, she would usually put on a light coat, take a short walk around the neighborhood to look at the expensive shops on Queensway, and then return to her room to rest before lunch. She felt completely insulated from the noise and the danger of the massive city whenever she was inside her room. Now, the Queen's Hotel operated on a very strict, highly regimented schedule for its housekeeping staff to ensure the guests were never disturbed unnecessarily. The chambermaids were required to move through the long, narrow corridors at very specific times to clean the rooms, empty the trash bins, and refresh the heavy linens. And one of the standard Very traditional services provided to the guests in the early afternoon was a midday tea service. So the maids would go down to the basement kitchens and load these heavy silver-plated metal trays with delicate ceramic teacups, small matching saucers, and freshly folded linen napkins. And then they would carry these heavy trays up the narrow service elevators and distribute them quietly to the occupied rooms on the upper floors. And on Sunday, September 17th, a young chambermaid was assigned to work the long hallway on Emmy's floor. The maid had a heavy metal master key attached to a brass ring on her belt, and she was pushing a small wooden utility cart loaded with fresh white towels and several of these fully prepared tea trays. It is roughly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the hotel is incredibly busy. There are dozens of guests checking out at the front desk. Downstairs, there are porters carrying heavy leather suitcases up and down the main staircases, and there is the constant loud hum of black taxicabs pulling up to the curb. Outside. So the chambermaid is working very quickly to stay on her strict schedule. She walks down the heavily carpeted hallway on the 3rd floor, stopping at each individual door. She knocks politely, waits a few seconds for a response, and if there is no answer, she uses her master key to enter the room and drop off the tea. And she finally reaches Emmy Werner's door. She picks up one of the heavy silver trays from her cart, balancing the ceramic cup and saucer carefully in her left hand, and she uses her right hand to knock firmly on the thick wood of the door. "Housekeeping midday service?" she calls out. But there is absolutely no answer from inside the room. "Mrs. Werner, I have your tea," she says, knocking a bit louder on the wood. And the hallway remains completely quiet. So the maid assumes that Emmy is still out, taking her afternoon walk around the neighborhood, or perhaps she is down in the main dining room, eating her lunch. The maid balances the heavy silver tray on her hip, slides her brass master key into the heavy lock, and turns the handle with a loud click. She pushes the heavy wooden door open and steps into the dimly lit room. The thick fabric curtains are still pulled tightly shut across the large windows, completely blocking out the bright afternoon sun and casting deep shadows across the furniture. The maid takes 2 steps onto the carpet and reaches her hand out to flip the main light switch on the wall. The overhead bulb flickers on, immediately illuminating the small room in a harsh yellow light. And the maid looks toward the center of the room to set the tray on the small table. But she stops completely still, and she immediately opens her fingers. The heavy silver tray slips entirely from her grip and crashes violently onto the floor. The delicate ceramic teacup shatters into dozens of sharp white pieces, and hot tea splashes heavily across her shoes and the carpet. Because Emmy Werner is not out for a walk and she is not eating lunch in the dining room, she is lying flat on her back in the exact center of the bed. Her face is heavily bruised, swollen, and covered in deep, dark lacerations. Her neat pressed clothing is completely torn and pulled away from her body, and there are thick, dark, perfectly distinct bruises circling her entire neck. She is not breathing. Her chest is completely still, and her eyes are open, staring blindly up at the plaster ceiling. The chambermaid immediately backs out of the room, her hands shaking violently, and she runs full speed down the long hallway, screaming at the top of her lungs for the hotel manager. Within minutes, the manager dials the emergency line, and dozens of officers from the Metropolitan Police arrive at the Queen's Hotel with their sirens blaring. They completely lock down the entire building, stationing uniformed officers at all the front and rear exits, physically preventing any guests, staff, or delivery drivers from leaving the premises. And the lead detectives run up the main stairs to Emmy's room and begin aggressively processing the scene. And normally when police get a dispatch call about a violent, deeply physical homicide occurring inside a luxury hotel in the exact middle of the day, they operate on a very specific foundational assumption. The detectives assume that the hotel is a highly secure, heavily monitored environment. They firmly believe that a violent intruder simply cannot walk into a luxury hotel lobby, bypass the front desk, bypass the porters, commit an incredibly loud, brutal murder, and then walk back out without being noticed by at least half a dozen people. They assume the killer has to be someone who officially belongs in the building, like a registered guest staying on the same floor or a staff member who has a master key and a legitimate reason to be walking the halls. So the detectives immediately set up a massive command post in one of the empty conference rooms on the ground floor. They systematically pull every single staff member into the room and interrogate them aggressively. They interview the receptionists, the cooks, the porters, and the other chambermaids. They demand to know exactly who walked through the heavy glass front doors between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, but the staff provides them with absolutely nothing useful. The lobby was incredibly chaotic with the Sunday checkout rush, so hundreds of people were coming and going constantly. And because the hotel was so massive and sprawling, people were constantly walking up and down the main staircases and using the elevators without anyone questioning them. So nobody noticed a stranger acting suspiciously. Nobody saw a man running down the stairs with blood on his hands or fresh scratch marks on his face. And absolutely nobody heard a single sound coming from Emmy's room. And as the medical examiner carefully examines Emmy's body on the bed, the reality of the crime becomes entirely impossible for the detectives to explain. The examiner determines that Emmy was subjected to a severe, prolonged physical beating before she was ultimately strangled to death. And a physical beating of that magnitude requires a massive amount of violent physical exertion. It inherently creates a tremendous amount of noise. There would be the heavy sound of footsteps scrambling across the floorboards. There would be the loud crash of furniture being bumped or overturned, and there would be the desperate sounds of a physical struggle as the victim tried to fight back. But the rooms in the Queen's Hotel share very thin walls. There were other guests actively staying in the room directly next door to Emmy, and there were guests staying in the room directly across the hallway. The police pull those specific guests into the hallway and question them immediately. But the guests all look totally confused and say the exact same thing. They were sitting quietly in their rooms all morning, reading books or packing their suitcases, and they heard absolutely nothing. No screams for help, no loud thuds against the wall, no signs of a fight whatsoever. So the detectives frantically look for a clear motive. They tear through Emmy's room looking for missing items, assuming it must have been a robbery gone wrong. But her small leather purse is still sitting perfectly untouched on the wooden dresser. Her cash is still inside her wallet, and her expensive jewelry is still sitting securely inside her travel case on the desk. It doesn't look like a standard burglary at all. The sheer, overwhelming brutality of the attack suggests a deeply personal rage, or perhaps an intruder who was completely panicked when Emmy suddenly woke up from a nap and saw his face. But the detectives cannot figure out how the killer even got into the room in the first place. The heavy wooden door was locked when the maid arrived, and there was absolutely no sign of forced entry on the brass lock or the doorframe. Did the killer pick the lock while standing in a busy hallway? Did he somehow steal a master key from an unattended maid's cart and slip inside? Or did Emmy, a woman who was historically incredibly cautious and deeply, quote, security conscious due to her traumatic past, willingly open her door to a complete stranger in the middle of a Sunday afternoon? The Metropolitan Police throw massive resources at the case. They spend months investigating every single angle. They track down known violent burglars operating in the Bayswater area and check their alibis. They heavily review the criminal backgrounds and personal histories of every single employee who worked at the Queen's Hotel, and they even reach out to international law enforcement agencies, just in case the killer was a foreign guest who had checked out immediately after the murder and flown out of the country before the police arrived. But they find absolutely zero leads, no usable fingerprints, and no murder weapon. The man who walked into that hotel room in the middle of a bustling Sunday simply vanished into the sprawling, endless crowds of London without leaving a single trace behind. And the deeply tragic irony of the case severely shook the British public when it hit the newspapers. Emmy Werner had miraculously survived the absolute worst atrocities of the 20th century. She had survived the industrialized death camps, the freezing winters, the starvation, and the systematic destruction of her entire bloodline. She had fought tooth and nail to pull herself out of the ashes of Europe and rebuild a peaceful, secure life for herself, only to be brutally beaten and murdered decades later in her sleep by a complete mystery intruder in a quiet, highly secure hotel room in one of the wealthiest and safest cities in the world. And to this day, the police do not have an explanation for who killed her, why they targeted her, or how they managed to escape a crowded building completely unseen. A woman who survived the absolute worst of humanity is murdered in her bed while surrounded by hundreds of people, and nobody hears a single sound or sees a single thing. But sometimes, the silence surrounding a brutal crime isn't what makes it so impossible to solve. Sometimes, the crime is completely impossible to solve because the person who actually committed the murder was the exact same person who was sitting in the interrogation room begging the police for help. In the late summer of 1973, A 36-year-old man named Tran Van Them was living in a very small, tightly knit farming village in the Bac Ninh province of northern Vietnam. And during this specific era, the country was heavily rural, and the national economy was incredibly strained. People in these small villages did not have bank accounts. They did not have access to heavy commercial transport, and they generally relied entirely on their own physical labor to survive. And Them was a man who took his responsibility to his family very seriously. He was married, he had young children running around his small house, and he was known in the village as someone who would take on absolutely any job to make sure they had food on the table. So in addition to working the agricultural fields, Them operate a small-scale traveling merchant. He would pool his money together, travel long distances on foot or by bicycle to other provinces, buy goods like agricultural supplies or livestock at a low price, and then haul everything back to his village to sell for a small profit. And this kind of merchant work was incredibly grueling. It required him to travel for days at a time over deeply rutted dirt roads, crossing rivers, and navigating through dense, isolated patches of forest. And because he was dealing strictly in cash, he was constantly carrying large bundles of paper currency tied directly to his body inside canvas bags. So it was an inherently risky way to make a living. And men who did this work rarely traveled alone. So Them partnered directly with his own cousin, a man who lived in the exact same village and whose family was deeply intertwined with his own. And the two men trusted each other completely. They had grown up running through the same dirt streets. They shared meals at family gatherings, and they relied on each other to watch their backs when they were out on the road. And in July of 1973, the two men planned a major trading trip. They gathered a significant amount of cash, packed a few changes of clothes into heavy canvas bags, and set off on their bicycles, heading northwest toward Vinh Phu province. And the journey took them several days of hard, relentless pedaling under the blistering summer sun. They navigated through heavy traffic near the larger towns and pushed their bikes up steep, unpaved inclines in the countryside. And by the late evening of their third day on the road, they were completely exhausted. The sun had completely set. And they were walking their bicycles down a very desolate, empty stretch of dirt road in the middle of Vinh Phu. There were no streetlights, there were no houses in sight, and the thick tree canopy on both sides of the road blocked out most of the moonlight. They were heavily weighed down by the cash strapped to their waists. Their leg muscles were cramping, and they knew they simply could not keep walking in the pitch black. So they stopped on the side of the road and looked for a place to rest for the night. And just a few yards off the main dirt path, sitting slightly elevated on a patch of dry dirt, they saw a very small, abandoned roadside hut. It was a simple rectangular structure made of stacked mud bricks with a heavily thatched roof made of dried palm leaves. It had no wooden door. Just an open doorway facing the road, and the floor inside was simply hard-packed earth. And in this region, small huts like this were very common. They were built by local farmers as temporary shelters to sit in during heavy rainstorms or to store small farming tools during the harvest season. And because it was totally empty and offered a solid roof over their heads, it looked like a perfectly safe, highly practical place to stop. So they pushed their heavy bicycles through the tall grass, leaned them against the inside wall of the hut, and sat down on the dirt floor. They ate a small portion of cold rice from their bags, double-checked the tight knots on the canvas pouches holding their money, and then lay down side by side on the hard earth to go to sleep. The only sound in the hut is the heavy rhythmic breathing of the two exhausted men and the low hum of insects out in the dark grass, and Them falls into a very deep, heavy sleep almost immediately. But a few hours later, in the absolute dead of night, the quiet inside the hut is violently broken. Them is suddenly jolted awake by the loud, heavy sound of a physical impact right next to his head. He opens his eyes, but the inside of the hut is so completely dark that he cannot see his own hands in front of his face. He hears his cousin let out a sharp, sudden gasp of air, followed immediately by the sound of someone frantically shuffling their feet on the dirt floor. And before Them can even sit up or call out his cousin's name, a heavy, blunt object swings down from the darkness and strikes him directly in the side of the head. The impact violently throws Them backward against the mud brick wall. He feels a massive surge of heat on the side of his face, and he immediately tastes blood in his mouth. He throws his arms up over his head, completely disoriented, and he feels someone stepping heavily on his legs. He reaches out blindly in the dark, his hands grabbing onto the rough fabric of a shirt that does not belong to his cousin. Them pulls hard on the fabric, twisting his body and throwing his weight forward to tackle the intruder. But the man in the dark rips himself free, kicking them hard in the chest. Them scrambles to his knees, grabbing blindly in the dirt for the intruder's ankles, but he hears the heavy, rapid thud of boots running out the open doorway and disappearing into the tall grass. Them collapses back onto the dirt floor, his head spinning violently. He reaches over to where his cousin was sleeping and feels the man's chest. His cousin is completely unresponsive, and his shirt is entirely soaked in warm blood. Them pulls himself up to his feet, leaning heavily against the brick wall for balance. Blood is pouring down his own face, dripping rapidly off his chin and soaking into the collar of his shirt. He stumbles out of the hut, walking blindly down the pitch-black dirt road, holding his hands over his head to apply pressure to the wound. He walks for nearly an hour, slipping in the dirt and nearly passing out multiple times, until he finally reaches a small cluster of houses in the next village. He begins pounding heavily on the first wooden door he finds, screaming for a doctor and begging someone to go back down the road to help his cousin. The local villagers wake up, see a man completely covered in blood standing on their steps, and they immediately run to get the local police. Within an hour, a team of officers holding heavy flashlights arrive at the roadside hut. They shine their lights inside and find the cousin lying on the dirt floor. He had sustained massive, catastrophic trauma to his head from a heavy weapon, and he is pronounced dead at the scene. The police secure the area, collect the bicycles, and they bring them to a local medical clinic where a doctor quickly wraps a thick cotton bandage around his head to stop the bleeding. And normally when police respond to a violent roadside robbery, where one man is killed and another is severely injured while running for help, they operate on a very basic, established assumption. The police assume that a highly dangerous, opportunistic highway robber is actively operating in the area. They immediately start heavily patrolling the local dirt roads. They set up checkpoints at the provincial borders, and they send detectives to interview the local villagers to see if anyone noticed a stranger washing blood off their clothes in the river. They treat the survivor as a critical witness and rely heavily on his testimony to build a profile of the attacker. But the police in Vinh Phu province did not set up checkpoints, and they did not send patrols to look for a highway robber. Because when the lead investigator stood inside that small roadside hut and looked at the crime scene, they made a completely different, highly damaging assumption. They looked at the dead body on the floor, and they looked at the canvas bags of cash that were still sitting securely inside the hut, and they realized that the attacker had not actually taken the money. They also looked at the medical report, which noted that while Them had a severe bleeding head wound, his skull was not fractured, and his injuries were completely survivable, whereas his cousin was killed almost instantly. So the police firmly believed they were looking at a staged crime scene. They assumed that the two cousins had gotten into a violent, bitter argument over how to split the trade money. They believed that Them had picked up a heavy piece of wood, bludgeoned his own cousin to death in the dark, and then deliberately struck himself in the head with a rock to create a superficial wound. They assumed he completely fabricated the story of a mystery attacker rushing into the hut solely to cover up a brutal, greed-fueled murder. So instead of treating them as a traumatized victim who had just watched his family member die, they treat him as a cold-blooded killer. The police walk into the medical clinic, pull them out of his chair, put heavy metal handcuffs on his wrists, and transport him directly to the provincial police station. They throw him into a small, windowless interrogation room, force him to sit in a hard wooden chair, and they begin a massive, relentless psychological assault. The detectives stand over him, yelling heavily in his face, accusing him of murdering his own blood relative. They refuse to let him sleep, they refuse to let him change his blood-soaked clothes, and they interrogate him for hours on end. I didn't touch him. Them says his voice completely raw from exhaustion. You have the money and he is dead, the lead interrogator replies, slapping a blank piece of paper down on the table. Sign the paper, or you will never leave this room. I was asleep when it happened, Them says, refusing to pick up the pen. But the police do not back down. The interrogation goes on for days. They keep him isolated in the dark, completely breaking down his mental state. And in the 1970s, the legal protections for a suspect in a rural holding cell were essentially non-existent. Them is in a state of absolute physical agony. From his untreated head wound, he is severely dehydrated. And his brain simply cannot process the trauma of the attack, combined with the relentless accusations. After several grueling days of this, his will completely breaks. He firmly believes that if he does not give the police exactly what they want, they are going to beat him to death in that small room, and nobody will ever know. So he reaches out with a shaking hand, picks up the pen, and signs his name at the bottom of a fully pre-written confession, stating that he murdered his cousin for the money. He assumes that once he gets out of that room and stands in front of a formal judge in a brightly lit courtroom, the legal system will easily see that the confession was forced. They will look at his own severe injuries, and they will clear his name. But he was completely wrong. The police formally charge him with premeditated murder and robbery. The news travels rapidly back to his home village in Bac Ninh, completely devastating his family. The murdered cousin's parents, siblings, and extended family firmly believe the police report. They look at the signed confession and they absolutely turn on them. They publicly disown him, they banish his wife and children from family gatherings, and they demand the absolute harshest penalty the law can provide. In 1974, Tran Van Them is brought into a crowded provincial courtroom. He is heavily restrained, and he stands before a panel of judges. He immediately retracts his confession, speaking loudly into the quiet room, detailing exactly how the police forced him to sign the paper under extreme duress. He points to the scar on his head and begs the court to realize that a man does not strike himself in the head with a heavy weapon just to steal money he already partially owned. But the judges do not listen. They look at the official police file, they look at the signature on the confession, and they slam the gavel down. Tran Van Them is officially found guilty of murder, and the court sentences him to death. He is transported to a maximum security prison and placed directly onto death row. He is locked inside a tiny, freezing concrete cell with a heavy, solid iron door. He is placed in heavy leg irons that are bolted directly to the floor, heavily restricting his movement. He spends his days sitting on the cold concrete listening to the heavy boots of the prison guards walking down the corridor, constantly terrified that they are coming to his door to take him to the execution grounds. He is completely isolated from the outside world, universally hated by his own village, and legally designated as a monster. And he sits in that concrete cell for over 2 years, just waiting to die. But in 1975, the entire foundation of the case quietly, completely collapses. In a totally different district, local police arrest a completely unrelated man named Phan Thanh Nan for a series of minor, unrelated thefts. They put this man in an interrogation room and begin questioning him about his criminal history. And during the course of the interview, this man casually admits that his crimes actually go much further back. He tells the detectives that in the summer of 1973, he was walking down a dark dirt road in Vinh Phu province. He says he saw 2 merchants sleeping inside an abandoned roadside hut. He admits that he picked up a heavy piece of wood, walked into the dark hut, and brutally attacked both men, intending to steal their bags of cash. But he says one of the men fought back aggressively, grabbing his shirt, so he panicked, kicked the man away, and ran out into the grass without taking the money. The detectives listen to this incredibly specific story, and they realize the details match a closed murder file perfectly. They check the records and realize they currently have a man sitting on death row, waiting to be executed for that exact crime. The government quietly investigates the new confession, verifies the details, and officially realizes they made a massive, catastrophic mistake. Tran Van Them was telling the absolute truth the entire time. So in early 1976, the heavy iron door to them cell unlocks. The guards walk in, unbolt his leg irons, and walk him out of the maximum security prison. But they do not hold a press conference. They do not issue a formal apology, and they do not legally exonerate his name on the official court record. They simply hand him a very brief, heavily stamped piece of paper called a certificate of release, give him a small amount of travel money, and tell him he is allowed to go home. And this complete lack of official exoneration creates an absolute nightmare for him. When Them walks back into his small farming village in Bac Ninh, he is not welcomed as a tragic victim of a flawed system. The villagers and his extended family look at the brief release paper, and they assume he was just let out on a legal technicality, or that the government simply decided not to execute him. They still firmly believe he is a cold-blooded murderer. His children are heavily bullied at school, his family is totally ostracized from the community, and he is forced to live completely isolated in the very town he grew up in. And for the next 40 years, Tran Van Them completely refuses to give up. He works the fields during the day to feed his family, and at night he writes hundreds of detailed multi-page letters to every single government office, judicial board, and police department in the country. He spends his own meager savings buying bus tickets to Hanoi, standing outside massive government buildings for hours holding his original court documents, begging for someone to officially review his case and clear his name. He grows old doing this. His hair turns completely white, his hands become heavily arthritic, and his children grow into adults under the heavy shadow of a father who is legally considered a killer. He fights the system for 4 entire decades. Finally, in August of 2016, the legal system completely yields. Tran Van Them is now 80 years old, frail, and walking with a heavy cane. The Supreme People's Court of Vietnam formally reviews his massive stack of petitions and officially recognizes the catastrophic failure of the 1974 trial. The government holds a highly publicized formal ceremony in his home province. Senior judicial officials stand on a stage in front of the press, the local villagers, and his extended family. They publicly read a formal legal exoneration, completely clearing his name of all charges. They issue a profound, highly formal apology for stealing his life, and they eventually award him a massive sum of financial compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. And if you recall that small abandoned roadside hut sitting just off the dirt path in the dark, that simple mud brick structure was built to offer passing travelers a brief moment of safety and shelter from the harsh elements. But for Tran Van Them, it was the exact opposite. That tiny room was the exact place where his life was violently ripped apart, acting as the starting point for a 40-year nightmare that nearly ended with him facing a firing squad. A man survives a brutal attack in the dark, only to spend the rest of his life fighting the exact people who were supposed to protect him. But sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you don't wait for you to survive an attack. Sometimes they are the ones who throw you into the water in the first place. In the early months of 1972, a 41-year-old man named Dr. George Duncan was living in the city of London, England. And George was a highly respected, deeply intellectual academic. He had spent essentially his entire adult life navigating the very quiet, very rigid world of high-level university education. He held advanced degrees in classical law he had studied at Cambridge, and he spent most of his days sitting inside massive, dusty libraries surrounded by towering stacks of legal textbooks. So George was basically a man who lived entirely inside his own head. He was incredibly soft-spoken. He was deeply private about his personal life, and he maintained a very strict, highly predictable daily routine. He wore heavy wool suits with leather patches on the elbows. He smoked a small wooden pipe, and he generally preferred the company of a good historical biography over sitting in a loud, crowded pub. He was a man who deliberately sought out peace and quiet wherever he could find it. But his preference for a very slow, quiet lifestyle was not just a personality trait. It was an absolute physical necessity. Because when George was much younger, long before the wide availability of highly advanced modern antibiotics, he had contracted a very severe aggressive case of tuberculosis. And the bacterial infection had completely ravaged his respiratory system. He had been forced to spend nearly a year of his youth completely isolated in a medical sanatorium, lying in a specialized hospital bed just fighting to breathe. And he did eventually beat the disease and recover. But the tuberculosis had left a permanent, heavily devastating mark on his body. The infection had created thick, hardened scar tissue across a massive portion of his lungs, permanently destroying his lower air sacs. So his breathing was always incredibly shallow and labored. He suffered from a chronic dry cough that would rattle in his chest when the weather got cold. And he could not perform any rigorous physical activity whatsoever. If he walked up a single flight of stairs too quickly, or if he carried a heavy box of books down the hallway, he would have to stop, lean his shoulder against the wall, and take long, desperate, gasping breaths just to recover his oxygen levels. So, he had simply accepted that he lived in a highly compromised physical vessel, and he moved through the world very slowly and very carefully to protect his damaged lungs. And in March of 1972, George was offered an incredibly prestigious academic position that would completely uproot his quiet life. The University of Adelaide, located all the way across the world in South Australia, formally asked him to join their faculty as a senior law lecturer. So George packed up his extensive personal library, boarded a massive commercial aircraft, and moved to Australia to start a brand new chapter. And he rented a very small, quiet flat on Mackinnon Parade, which was a quiet residential street located just a short walking distance from the university campus. He unpacked his books, he set up his desk, and he began teaching his law classes. Now, the city of Adelaide in the early 1970s was a very unique environment. It was widely known across the country as the City of Churches. It was a deeply traditional, heavily conservative, and strictly religious city where social rules were heavily enforced by the community. People dressed very modestly, the shops closed early on Sundays, and any deviation from the standard social norm was heavily frowned upon. And importantly, in 1972, homosexuality in South Australia was a severe criminal offense. It was strictly outlawed, and men who were caught engaging in homosexual relationships were regularly arrested, thrown into heavy prisons, completely publicly shamed in the local newspapers, and essentially banished from polite society. So for gay men living in Adelaide, absolute secrecy was a matter of basic physical survival. They could not go to standard bars, and they could not be seen together in restaurants. So the local gay community had established a series of very quiet, completely covert meeting places in the city. And the most prominent of these locations was the grassy bank of the River Torrens. Now the River Torrens is a slow-moving, dark, muddy river that cuts directly through the exact center of Adelaide. During the day, the parklands surrounding the river are filled with university students reading on the grass and families having picnics under the massive weeping willow trees. But at night, the families pack up their blankets and go home. The heavy streetlights on the upper paved roads do not reach the lower dirt walking paths near the water, so the lower banks of the river become completely pitch black, totally silent and entirely deserted by the general public. And gay men would quietly walk down to the dark riverbank late at night just to find a few minutes of community and connection in the shadows, completely hidden from the rigid laws of the city above them. And George Duncan was a gay man. He had kept this fact completely hidden from his academic colleagues and his family for his entire life. But having just arrived in a brand new city where he did not know a single person, he was incredibly lonely. So on the evening of Wednesday, May 10th, 1972, George finished grading a stack of legal papers at his small desk in his rented flat. The weather was unusually cold for the autumn season, with a sharp, freezing wind blowing through the city streets. George put on a heavy tweed jacket, locked his front door, and decided to take a walk. He walked slowly down the paved sidewalks, taking his time so he didn't aggravate his lungs, and he headed directly toward the university campus. He crossed the road and walked down the steep, grassy embankment toward the dark edge of the River Torrens. It is roughly 11 o'clock at night. The parklands are completely silent except for the sound of the freezing wind moving through the heavy branches of the willow trees and the dark water lapping gently against the muddy bank. George walks down to a small, dark patch of grass, located very close to a pedestrian footbridge that crosses the river. He takes his wooden pipe out of his pocket, lights it, and just stands there in the dark, looking out over the water, waiting to see if anyone else is walking the paths. And suddenly, he hears the heavy, rhythmic crunch of footsteps walking rapidly down the gravel path directly behind him. George turns around, expecting to see another lone man walking in the shadows. But instead, a group of large, physically imposing men completely emerges from the darkness. They are wearing plain, heavy civilian jackets, and they are moving with intense speed and purpose. George assumes they are just taking a shortcut across the grass, so he steps slightly backward toward the water to let them pass. But they do not walk past him. They step completely off the gravel path, fan out across the grass, and rapidly close the distance, completely surrounding him on the narrow bank. "What are you doing down here?" one of the men asks, his voice low and aggressive. "I'm just taking a walk," George replies, pulling his pipe away from his mouth. "Grab his arms," the first man says. And before George can even take a breath to call out for help, two of the large men step forward and grab him violently by the shoulders and the waist. They do not demand his wallet. They do not ask him for his expensive wristwatch. They simply lift him entirely off his feet. They swing his body heavily backward to generate momentum, and then they hurl him forward through the freezing air. George falls down the steep, slippery embankment and crashes violently into the deep, pitch-black water of the River Torrens. The men stand on the bank for a few seconds, look down at the dark water, laugh loudly, and then turn around and sprint back up the dirt path toward the streetlights, leaving George completely alone in the river. The next morning, a local council worker was walking across the university footbridge on his way to work. He looked over the metal railing and saw a heavy tweed jacket floating in the muddy water near the reeds. He immediately ran to a telephone and called the local police. A recovery dive team arrived at the parklands, waded into the freezing river, and pulled George Duncan's body out of the water. And normally, when a respected foreign academic is found dead in a city river in the middle of the night and his pockets are found completely empty, the local police operate on a very specific foundational assumption. The detectives assume that the man was the victim of a random, opportunistic street robbery. They assume that a violent mugger was hiding in the bushes, jumped out, demanded the man's wallet, and pushed him into the river during the physical struggle before running away with the cash. And this is exactly what the Adelaide police told the public. The local newspapers immediately printed headlines about a tragic, isolated mugging on the riverbank that resulted in a terrible accidental drowning. But when the local medical examiner placed George's body on the stainless steel table and began the official autopsy, he realized that the police were totally wrong about their most basic assumption. The examiner looked closely at George's skull and his torso. There were absolutely no defensive bruises on his forearms. There were no broken bones, and there was no blunt force trauma to the back of his head. He had not been knocked unconscious before he hit the water. He was completely awake and fully aware when he went into the river. And then the examiner opened George's chest and looked at his respiratory system. And if you recall, that severe case of tuberculosis that George had contracted in his youth, that infection had permanently ravaged his lower air sacs, leaving thick, hardened bands of scar tissue across his lungs and severely restricting his ability to process oxygen. So, when the men violently threw George into the freezing water of the Torrens, his body experienced massive, instantaneous thermal shock. The freezing temperature caused his diaphragm to spasm violently, forcing his body to involuntarily take a massive, desperate gasp for air. But because his lungs were so heavily damaged and scarred, he simply did not have the physical capacity to hold his breath. When he gasped, his compromised lungs instantly filled with heavy, muddy river water. He could not yell for help. He could not kick his heavy wool trousers to tread water, and he could not swim. The lack of oxygen caused him to lose consciousness almost immediately, and he sank directly to the muddy bottom of the river like a stone. The men on the bank didn't just push him into the water to get his wallet. They threw a severely disabled man into a freezing river where he had absolutely no physical chance of surviving. And a few days later, the entire narrative of a random robbery completely fell apart because another man walked into the office of a local journalist totally terrified and asked to make a statement. This second man, named Roger James, told the journalist that he had been walking on the banks of the River Torrens on that exact same Wednesday night, just a few hundred yards away from where George was standing. And Roger said that a group of large men had also surrounded him in the dark. They had grabbed him, physically broken his leg, and violently hurled him into the deep water. But Roger was a very strong, highly capable swimmer with completely healthy lungs. So despite his broken bone, he managed to paddle his way back to the muddy bank and crawl out of the river after the men ran away. And Roger had looked very closely at the men's faces under the distant streetlights before they threw him in. He told the journalist that the men on the riverbank did not ask for money. They were not random thugs. They were off-duty police officers. They were senior members of the Adelaide Vice Squad. The explosive reveal completely shook the entire city of Adelaide to its core. The men who threw George Duncan to his death were not anonymous criminals. They were the exact people tasked with enforcing the law. The Adelaide Vice Squad had a long-standing, deeply brutal, and completely secret tradition of getting off their official shifts, changing into civilian clothing, and going down to the River Torrens specifically to hunt gay men. They called it poofter bashing. They would find men standing in the dark, beat them severely, and throw them into the freezing water purely for their own entertainment, knowing that the victims would be far too terrified of being arrested for homosexuality to ever go to the police station and report the assaults. It was a completely state-sanctioned, deeply systemic ring of violence that had been operating in the shadows for years. They assumed George Duncan was just another anonymous gay man they could humiliate, completely unaware that his damaged lungs would turn their brutal game into a homicide. When the local newspapers published the survivor's story, the public outrage was absolutely deafening. The citizens of Adelaide demanded an immediate, transparent investigation into the Vice Squad. But the local police force immediately closed ranks. Official incident reports went completely missing from the station filing cabinets. Key witnesses who tried to come forward were heavily intimidated by uniformed officers showing up at their homes in the middle of the night. The local detectives assigned to investigate the drowning stonewalled the press completely, refusing to arrest their own colleagues. The situation became so incredibly toxic and the cover-up was so blatant that the Premier of South Australia was forced to intervene directly. He realized he could not trust his own police force to investigate a murder they had committed. So he completely bypassed the local authorities and requested emergency help from the British government. He had two highly experienced, elite homicide detectives from New Scotland Yard in London immediately put on a plane and flown across the world to Adelaide to tear the local police department apart. The Scotland Yard detectives set up a secure, independent office and began aggressively interviewing the Vice Squad officers. They pulled the police rosters, they checked the alibis, and they gathered enough circumstantial evidence to definitively prove that 3 specific Vice Squad officers were present on the riverbank that night. The British detectives wrote a massive, highly detailed, and deeply damning confidential report, concluding that the police were undeniably responsible for George's death. But when they handed the report to the local prosecutors, the systemic corruption held firm. The prosecutors claimed that because it was dark and because George was dead, the survivor's testimony was not strong enough to secure a murder conviction in court against decorated police officers. The 3 Vice Squad officers were eventually brought up on very minor disciplinary charges, and they were quietly allowed to resign from the police force, completely avoiding any prison time. Nobody was ever formally convicted of murdering Dr. George Duncan. But the sheer injustice of a quiet, disabled academic being thrown into a river by the police ignited a massive, unstoppable political earthquake across the country. The public realized that the only reason the police felt comfortable hunting these men in the dark was because the laws of the state explicitly classified gay men as criminals. The death of George Duncan became a massive rallying cry for sweeping social reform, and less than 3 years after his body was pulled from the water, the South Australian Parliament bowed to the immense public pressure. In 1975, they completely rewrote their legal code, becoming the very first state in the entire country of Australia to fully decriminalize homosexuality. A quiet, highly educated man is thrown into a dark river by the exact people who were sworn to protect the city, and the resulting investigation fundamentally changes the laws of an entire nation. But sometimes a criminal walking into a heavily guarded building with a loaded weapon isn't trying to change the laws of a nation at all. Sometimes they are just trying to get enough money to change themselves. On a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1972, a 27-year-old man named John Wadowitz was sitting in the front seat of a heavy, beat-up American sedan parked on a busy street in Brooklyn, New York. And it was the absolute peak of the summer, so the temperature outside was pushing 90 degrees, and the air was incredibly thick with humidity and the smell of hot asphalt. So John and his 2 passengers had the windows of the car rolled completely down, just trying to catch a breeze from the passing traffic. And John was a local guy who had lived in the city his entire life. He had served in the military during the Vietnam War, and when he came back home, he had spent a significant amount of time working as a standard teller at a local commercial bank. So he knew exactly how the financial system operated from the inside out. He knew exactly what time the heavy steel vaults were opened in the morning. He knew exactly how the female tellers balanced their cash drawers at the end of the shift. And he knew exactly when the armored trucks arrived to collect the daily deposits. And this deep insider knowledge gave him an intense, completely unwavering sense of confidence. He firmly believed that robbing a bank was just a simple matter of timing and logistics, and he assumed he could pull it off without anyone getting hurt. Now, John was living a very complicated, highly demanding double life. He was officially married to a woman and had children living out in the suburbs, but he was also deeply embedded in the underground gay scene in New York City. And he had recently participated in an unofficial, highly publicized wedding ceremony with a transgender woman named Ernest Aaron. And Ernest was in a state of deep personal crisis because she desperately wanted to undergo a highly expensive gender reassignment surgery, but she simply did not have the funds. The medical procedure cost exactly $2,500. And John was completely broke, constantly borrowing cash just to buy groceries, and he had absolutely no way to legally acquire that kind of money. So he decided that he was going to use his insider knowledge of the banking system to forcibly take the money from a local branch. So he recruited two very young, highly inexperienced men from his neighborhood to help him. He brought in an 18-year-old kid named Salvatore Naturale, who was sitting in the passenger seat holding a long, heavy cardboard box containing a pump-action shotgun. And sitting in the back seat was a 20-year-old kid named Arthur Bell, who was visibly shaking, staring down at his own shoes, and constantly wiping the heavy sweat off his forehead. And their target was a very specific small brick building sitting right on the corner of Avenue P in the Gravesend neighborhood. It was a standard Chase Manhattan Bank branch. It had a flat tar roof, heavy double glass doors, facing the busy sidewalk and large plate glass windows that allowed anyone walking by to look directly into the main lobby. And John had timed their arrival perfectly. It was just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which was the exact time the bank officially locked its doors to the public, and the tellers began counting the large stacks of cash sitting in their open drawers. So the three men get out of the hot sedan and walk down the concrete sidewalk. John is wearing a dark, heavy suit despite the blistering heat. And tucked tightly under his right arm, he is carrying a very large folded canvas duffel bag, specifically brought to hold massive, heavy stacks of unrecorded $100 bills from the main vault. He reaches out, pulls the heavy metal handle of the glass door, and walks into the bank. The blast of the central air conditioning hits his face, instantly cooling the sweat on his neck. There are 7 female tellers standing behind a long, open wooden counter, quietly stacking rolls of silver coins. There is a male security guard standing near the front door, and there is a female bank manager sitting at a metal desk in a small side office. But almost immediately, the flawless plan completely falls apart. Arthur walks through the glass doors, takes one look at the armed security guard, takes one look at the tellers, and his nerve completely shatters. He stands totally still on the linoleum floor for about 5 seconds, his breathing incredibly shallow. And then he just turns around, pushes the glass door open, walks out onto the sidewalk, gets into a nearby car, and drives away. He completely abandons the heist before a single word is even spoken. So John is suddenly down a man, but he refuses to stop. He reaches his hand under his suit jacket and pulls out a heavy steel pistol. Sal immediately rips the cardboard box open and pulls out the long pump-action shotgun, aiming it directly at the ceiling. "Nobody move and nobody gets hurt," John says loudly. He orders the security guard to drop his weapon and stand against the brick wall. He orders the bank manager to walk over to the front doors, engage the heavy brass deadbolt, and flip the open sign to closed. And then he orders all 7 female tellers to step away from their cash drawers and sit down on the hard floor in the center of the lobby. The women comply immediately, holding their hands in their laps, completely silent. John walks directly over to the main manager, points his pistol at her chest, and demands the heavy brass keys to the main vault in the back room. She pulls a large ring of keys from her pocket and hands them over. John unfolds his heavy canvas bag, walks down the short hallway, and slides the key into the massive steel door of the vault. He pulls the heavy door open, expecting to see massive wooden pallets, completely loaded with neat stacks of untraceable currency. But the thick metal shelves inside the vault are almost entirely empty. Because John's insider knowledge was completely flawed. He had assumed the armored car picked up the cash at the very end of the day, after the doors closed. But the bank had recently changed its schedule, and the armored truck had arrived just 30 minutes earlier, completely clearing out the bank's massive daily holdings. There is absolutely no vault cash left. The only money remaining in the entire building is a small amount of low-denomination bills sitting in the teller drawers out in the lobby, totaling roughly $30,000. It is an incredibly small fraction of the massive haul he had planned for. But John refuses to leave empty-handed. He walks back out to the lobby, goes behind the wooden counter, and begins frantically shoveling the small, crumpled stacks of $1 and $5 bills from the drawers directly into his heavy canvas bag. And then he makes his second massive mistake. John knows from his time as a teller that the bank keeps a heavy paper master ledger on the manager's desk, which specifically records the serial numbers of all the bills in the building. He knows that if the police find that ledger, they can easily track the stolen money. So he grabs the thick paper book, throws it into a metal trash can in the corner of the office, and drops a lit match inside. The dry paper instantly catches fire, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the air. But John didn't account for the building's ventilation system. The powerful air conditioning return vents suck the heavy black smoke directly up into the ceiling ducts and blow it straight out of the exhaust pipes on the flat roof. A business owner working in a shop directly across the street sees the thick black smoke billowing out of the top of the bank. He assumes the electrical wiring in the old brick building has caught fire, so he immediately picks up his telephone and calls the local fire department. And just a few minutes later, the telephone sitting on the bank manager's desk begins ringing loudly. John stops shoveling the cash, walks into the office, and picks up the heavy plastic receiver. But it is not the fire department on the other end of the line. It is a captain from the New York Police Department. The police had arrived expecting a minor trash fire, but one of the officers had looked through the large plate glass windows from the sidewalk and saw Sal holding a shotgun. The captain tells John very calmly that the entire building is completely surrounded by dozens of armed officers. The roads are totally blocked off in every direction, and there is absolutely no physical way out of the neighborhood. John hangs up the phone and looks out the large plate glass windows. There are dozens of black and white police cruisers parked completely sideways across Avenue P, blocking all the traffic lanes. Uniformed police officers are crouching tightly behind the heavy steel doors of their cars, resting the barrels of their service revolvers on the window frames pointing them directly at the bank. And John realizes he is completely trapped. He does not have a getaway car waiting in an alley, he does not have a tunnel system, and he is stuck in a small brick box with a single teenager holding a shotgun. But instead of panicking, instead of demanding a helicopter or trying to dig through the drywall, John does something completely absurd. He grabs the bank manager by the sleeve of her blouse, pulls her to the front glass doors, and forces her to unlock the deadbolt. He pushes the heavy door open, steps completely out onto the concrete sidewalk, and stands in the blistering heat holding his pistol down by his leg. The police officers instantly tense up, yelling at him to drop the weapon and put his hands on his head. But John completely ignores their weapons. He starts yelling aggressively back at the police captain, waving his free hand in the air, aggressively pacing back and forth on the sidewalk like he is having an argument in a local bar. He engages in this loud, highly theatrical, entirely public negotiation right in the middle of the street. And because it is a very warm summer evening in a highly dense residential neighborhood, hundreds of local residents come pouring out of their brick apartment buildings to see what all the sirens are about. The police try to push the crowds back, setting up heavy wooden sawhorses across the intersections. But the sheer volume of people completely overwhelms them. A massive, chaotic crowd of thousands of civilians completely surrounds the bank. They are sitting on the roofs of parked cars, they are leaning far out of their fire escapes, and they are standing shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalks, just watching this man in a dark suit scream at the police. And then the local television news vans arrive. They park their heavy trucks right against the police barricades, set up massive broadcast cameras on the pavement, and begin broadcasting the entire standoff completely live across the entire city. And John suddenly realizes he is not just a trapped bank robber anymore. He is the absolute center of a massive media spectacle. So he leans entirely into the chaos. He walks back inside the bank, but he doesn't tie the hostages up. And he doesn't lock them in the vault. He is actually incredibly polite to the women. He lets them use the restroom whenever they want. He lets them sit in the comfortable chairs in the manager's office. And he even lets them use the bank's landline phones to call their husbands and tell them they are going to be a little bit late for dinner. The hostages become completely relaxed, realizing that John has absolutely no intention of hurting them, and they just sit around watching him perform for the cameras outside. And around 8 o'clock at night, the women mention that they are getting hungry. So John picks up the phone, calls a local pizza parlor down the street, and orders several large pizzas and sodas for the hostages. A few minutes later, a teenage delivery boy walks nervously up to the police barricade, holding a stack of flat cardboard boxes. The police check the boxes, pat the boy down, and let him walk up to the glass doors of the bank. John opens the door and takes the pizzas from the kid. And then John reaches his hand directly into that heavy canvas duffel bag resting on the counter. The exact bag he had brought specifically to carry massive, untraceable wealth to fund his partner's life-saving surgery. John pulls out a handful of the stolen bank money, peels off several low-denomination bills, and hands them to the teenage delivery boy as a generous tip for walking through a police line. And then John turns around, walks back out onto the sidewalk, reaches his hand into his pockets, and violently throws thick handfuls of the stolen bank cash straight up into the air. The bills flutter down through the humid air and scatter across the pavement in front of the police cars. The massive crowd of civilians completely loses its mind. They start cheering violently for John, screaming his name and pushing aggressively against the wooden barricades, trying to reach the money. John starts actively hyping the crowd up, turning a massive federal hostage situation into a bizarre televised block party. But as the sun completely sets and the streetlights flicker on, the local police captain is abruptly pushed aside. Massive black sedans pull up to the barricades and dozens of federal agents wearing heavy tactical gear step out into the street. The FBI has officially arrived, and they take absolute control of the scene. And they have absolutely no interest in entertaining the crowd or allowing the media circus to continue. The lead FBI agent walks over to a utility pole on the corner and completely cuts the main power line running directly into the bank. The lights inside the lobby instantly go out, plunging the tellers into total darkness. The heavy central air conditioning system immediately shuts down. The temperature inside the sealed brick building rapidly begins to climb, turning the room into a sweltering, pitch-black oven. The mood inside the bank shifts instantly from a bizarre waiting game to a deeply tense, highly dangerous survival situation. The tellers start crying in the dark, and Sal begins nervously pumping the action on his shotgun, terrified that the tactical teams are going to breach the windows at any second. John realizes the situation is deteriorating rapidly, and he is losing total control. So he gets on the phone with the lead FBI negotiator and makes his final non-negotiable demand. He demands that the government provide a large, fully fueled passenger jet waiting on the runway at John F. Kennedy International Airport. He demands a heavy transport vehicle to take him, Sal, and the hostages directly from the front doors of the bank to the tarmac. And he tells the agent that if the vehicle does not arrive quickly, Sal is going to start executing the bank employees one by one in the dark. And the FBI agrees to his terms. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, a massively elongated heavy airport limousine drives slowly through the police barricades and parks directly in front of the glass doors of the bank. An FBI agent dressed entirely in plain civilian clothes is sitting quietly in the driver's seat with his hands resting on the steering wheel. John and Sal instruct the hostages to form a tight human shield around them. They open the glass doors, walk out into the flashing red and blue police lights, and pile into the back of the limousine. The bank manager and the tellers are crammed into the heavy leather seats, completely exhausted and sweating heavily. Sal sits in the front passenger seat directly next to the driver, holding his shotgun vertically between his knees with the barrel pointed at the roof. John sits in the very back, holding his pistol aimed squarely at the back of the driver's head. The limousine slowly pulls away from the curb, leaving the massive cheering crowd behind, and drives on to the empty Belt Parkway. They are escorted by dozens of police cars with their sirens completely silenced. The drive takes nearly 40 minutes, the only sound inside the car being the low hum of the engine and the heavy breathing of the hostages. They finally pass through the heavy chain-link security gates of John F. Kennedy International Airport and drive directly out onto the massive flat concrete tarmac. And sitting roughly 100 yards away, brightly illuminated by massive industrial floodlights, is a large commercial passenger plane with its engines quietly idling, waiting for them to board. The limousine pulls up near the rolling metal stairs of the aircraft and puts the car in park. John looks out the window at the plane, completely believing that he has actually won. He thinks he is going to board the flight, fly to a non-extradition country, and somehow figure out a way to get the surgery money later. He lowers his pistol slightly, relaxing his grip on the steel handle. The FBI agent sitting in the driver's seat turns his head slightly towards Sal and calmly asks him if he wants to grab some food from the terminal before they board the long flight. Sal looks away from the driver for a fraction of a second to look out the window at the terminal building. And in that exact millisecond, the FBI agent pulls a hidden short-barreled revolver from underneath his leg, points it directly across the center console, and fires a single deafening shot at point-blank range directly into Sal's chest. The blast is incredibly loud inside the enclosed car. Sal slumps heavily forward against the plastic dashboard, dropping the shotgun onto the floor mats, instantly dead. Before John can even raise his pistol, the heavy doors of the limousine are violently ripped open from the outside by dozens of federal agents who had been hiding on the dark tarmac. They grab John by the collar of his suit, drag him roughly out of the car, and slam him face first onto the hard concrete, pinning his arms behind his back and throwing heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The terrified hostages are quickly pulled out of the back seats and rushed away to safety, completely physically unharmed but deeply traumatized by the sudden explosion of violence right next to them. John Wojtowicz was formally indicted on federal bank robbery and kidnapping charges. He was tried in a federal courtroom, found guilty by a jury, and sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The completely bizarre, highly theatrical 14-hour standoff, the cheering crowds, and the pizza delivery became so incredibly famous across the country that it was directly adapted into the massive Oscar-winning Hollywood film called Dog Day Afternoon. John was actually paid a very substantial amount of money by the film studio for the exclusive rights to his life story, and in a deeply ironic twist, he took a large portion of that movie money and gave it directly to his partner, who was finally able to undergo the gender reassignment surgery she had desperately wanted. He walked into a bank completely desperate for cash, ended up throwing the stolen money into the street to buy the love of a crowd, and only secured the funds by getting arrested and turning his crime into a movie. And to this day, it remains one of the most absurd, heavily documented bank robberies in American history. A man attempts a violent heist and inadvertently turns himself into a folk hero on live television, while his accomplice pays the ultimate price. But sometimes the most bizarre crimes don't happen on live broadcasts in front of thousands of cheering people. Sometimes they happen in completely empty rooms, where the only witness is the cold, hard ground.